Good morning, everyone. I'm Debbie Hart. I'm the CEO of BioNJ, a job that I absolutely love. Welcome to BioNJ's 5th Annual Patient Advocacy Summit, a gathering that I also love, although I have to say I would love it a whole lot more if we were in person. I hope you and your colleagues and your families are staying safe and well in this difficult time. And we're happy to have the opportunity to bring you this year's summit in the safety of your own personal workspace. A special thank you to our very hardworking volunteer committee whose contributions have been instrumental in developing today's program. And Randy Bromberg, our VP Communications and Marketing, who led this effort and who you'll be seeing and hearing from throughout the program today. Thank you to our very generous sponsors. Today's event would not be possible without you. At BioNJ, our mission is to help our members help patients. And because patients can't wait, today's event is at the very core of that mission. BioNJ offers patient advocacy organizations complimentary membership. And if you are not yet a member, I invite you to learn more. Kim Minton on the BioNJ team is happy to speak with you at any time. We'll share her contact information at the end of the program. So medical innovation has reached unparalleled heights as the biopharmaceutical industry moves at lightning speed to discover therapies to combat the coronavirus while continuing research, development, and manufacturing of tomorrow's cures for a wide array of critical diseases. However, as we hear in the news every day, it is also a challenging time in reference to patient access and the state of healthcare. It's for this reason that BioNJ continues to share and create tools to assist our members, legislators, and patient organizations in conversations on the value of medical innovation and the importance of patient access. So I invite you to visit bionj.org/protect medical innovation to learn more and to help us protect medical innovation exactly. Together, we can help ensure that patients have the medicines that they need when they need them. So our goal for today's program is to educate, engage, and empower. We have an extraordinary roster of people to help us meet that goal, made up of patients, advocates, caregivers, as well as legislators, industry, and medical professionals, each bringing with them unique perspectives and experiences. Before we dive into the meat of the program with our panels, I'd like to give a very special and warm shout out to Bristol Myers Squibb. BMS, originally with Celgene, has hosted every one of our patient advocacy summits since the very first one 5 years ago. And as I mentioned, of course, we miss being with you in person this year at one of their very lovely facilities. However, we are very, very grateful for BMS's continued support. It is now with great pleasure that I introduce General Manager and Head of U.S. Cardiovascular, Immunology, and Oncology for BMS, Adam Lenkowski. Adam, welcome this morning. So happy to be with you, and the floor is yours.
Debbie, thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I'm absolutely honored that BioNJ invited me to open this year's Patient Advocacy Summit. We've had a tremendous partnership over the years. As Debbie mentioned, I'm Adam Lenkowski. I lead our U.S. commercial organization at Bristol Myers Squibb. And in January, I'll be with the company for 24 years. I want to welcome and thank you all for joining this morning. And I hope you're as energized as I am to learn from the various panel discussions, and hope you'll be inspired by our participants' passion to help patients. I gotta tell you, of my 24 years with the company, I worked very closely with advocacy organizations, patient organizations, over multiple therapeutic areas. And I truly believe that collaboration is essential to make the progress that we desperately need to help patients. Give you a couple examples. Years ago, I worked in HIV, and we collaborated with HIV advocacy organizations to ensure that AIDS patients would have unrestricted access to care. I worked several years in mental health and worked closely with NAMI and mental health advocacy organizations, not only to destigmatize mental health, but during the advent, if you remember way back when, around Medicare Part D, to ensure access to care and to eliminate step edits and prior authorizations for patients with mental illness. And Over the last decade or so, I've been working with oncology organizations to help cancer patients and their families. So I've seen up close and personal how important collaboration is, which is just essential to achieving our collective goal to help patients. Debbie, you mentioned, I think it's an understatement when I say that this has been an unprecedented year for all of us. I think while all of us continue to face the challenges of this COVID pandemic, at Bristol Myers Squibb, we have continued to apply science to help transform patients' lives while also working to remove barriers to access to our medicines. So as we review today's agenda, you're going to note that BioNJ is serving up what I think is really timely and important topics for us to focus on. That includes more diverse and inclusive approaches in the drug development process. It includes redefining and reframing healthcare policy priorities, a topic that COVID-19 has brought to the forefront. I think step therapy reform is a prime case study that we'll talk about. And finally, drawing on lessons learned, I think many in the battle against COVID to advance and accelerate discovery and development to help patients desperately in need of breakthrough treatments. So before I turn it back over to Debbie, COVID-19, I think, has put a magnifying glass on social and healthcare disparities that African American and other minority patient communities face every single day. And it's been devastating, truly, to witness the disproportionately higher rates of contracting the virus that underserved communities have experienced. And we have seen time and time again, and also through studies, the corresponding poorer outcomes for minority patients. The most vulnerable and heavily impacted patient populations, they have to be the focus, I think, of all aspects of the response, including mitigation, clinical care and recovery, vaccination preparedness, and delivery. We just can't leave these underserved communities behind. And as a healthcare community, we all have an obligation, I think, to meet these needs. And what I have seen in the pharmaceutical industry this year, our industry has never demonstrated better collaboration across biopharma companies, across academia, working with patient groups and with states and even the federal government. So we need, I think, strong and responsive public health and healthcare systems that reach out to engage patients and help enable access to care. I'd like to share just a couple of ways that at Bristol Myers Squibb, we're approaching this challenge. We are taking on action on really several fronts, both internally in terms of increasing diversity and inclusion across our employee population and our culture, but also externally, we announced a $300 million commitment over the next 5 years to actively address health disparities that will increase clinical trial diversity, expand supplier diversity, extend employee giving, and also increase workforce diversity. We're also working much more purposefully than ever, listening and learning from our communities and experts in healthcare equity, looking at social justice through research and outreach, and joining coalitions like the Biopharma Preparedness and Treatment Equity Coalition. So we have made at Bristol Myers Squibb health equity and diversity and inclusion strategic priorities across the organization and imperatives that are going to permeate throughout our business. But I've said before in multiple forums that we cannot do it alone. BMS can't do it alone. So I'm really looking forward to the panel on improving diversity and inclusion efforts in drug development and the importance of collaboration. And then later this morning, we'll have an opportunity to hear a case study on exploring recent efforts around step therapy reform as a case example. And I know that many of the organizations here today have been actively advocating for reform of this fail first, quote unquote, practice across the country for multiple years. So we know that this approach can be significantly detrimental to patient health and ignores completely the recommendations of physicians, specialists, and even data that shows that putting fail first policies in place across a number of therapeutic areas hurt patient outcomes. So Ken, I think at my company, we often hear the words patients are waiting, but at BioNJ, I think it aptly reminds us, in fact, patients can't wait. So there's so much more that we can do to improve patient outcomes, and this forum is going to provide, I think, a great opportunity for healthcare advocates to come together, solve issues, learn from each other, and from our collective best practices. And your perspectives are going to be invaluable today. So we look forward to continuing this conversation, this dialogue, to find additional ways that we can educate and make sure that we are providing the right care and support for patients. So thank you for joining me today and joining this great meeting. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the event. So with that, I'll turn it back to Debbie, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. So thanks for being here, and for all of the support that you and BMS have given us. And I just have to, a special recognition of the amazing commitment that you've made to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's really just extraordinary. And I know that you were one of the first to really step up and do something, and the level at which you're doing it is just obviously much needed and extraordinary. So thank you so much for that. So I'd also like to give a special shout out to Adam, to your wonderful colleagues. So Assemblyman Adam Taliaferro and Ethan Hasbrook, who have helped lead the way on today's program, and really so many other things. They are really two main points of contact at BMS, and really help us partner with you at even higher levels. So thank you to all of the team at BMS.
Thanks, Debbie. And both Adam and Ethan have been just tremendously inspirational for all of us inside the walls at BMS. So thanks so much.
Thank you. So now we are going to dive right in. So, and Adam really kicked off the topic area. So lack of diversity and inclusion within the drug development process applies to race, age, gender, socioeconomic status, and even disease state. And although the onset of COVID-19 has helped to place this important topic in the spotlight, there's still a lot of work to be done. So our panel of experts is here to show us how industry, advocates, and patients can help to drive change. There will be time at the end for questions, so I'd invite you to please type your questions into the chat box. To lead this conversation, I also ask you to welcome Director of State Public Policy and External Affairs, North American Public Affairs for Novartis, Vicki Walton. Vicki, thank you so much for being with us, and please take it away.
Yes, thank you, Debbie, for that nice introduction. And thank you, Adam, for discussing what we're going to talk about today, kind of giving an intro into the disparities in health inequities that we're facing. And I'm extremely excited to moderate this educational session on diversity and inclusion in drug development. This session is critically important because as we continue to explore the longstanding health inequities that was just discussed and the challenges faced by many marginalized communities, it is imperative that we have this conversation. And as Adam stated, the COVID pandemic has propelled a nationwide focus on understanding and addressing health inequities, which we now see more clearly leads to those poor health outcomes for many, many patients. We're seeing it every day. We're hearing it every day. So we've got to do better as a country. So it's important that we engage in honest conversations like we're doing today, and identifying all those barriers to equity and taking concrete steps to remove those disparities within our healthcare system. It's imperative that we pull together collaboration of stakeholders, which was discussed earlier, dedicated to sustainable and measurable outcomes. So this is not just something right now. This is something that we have to do. This is a work that we have to do long term. And one of the areas of focus today is diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. We really want to hone in on that area because we recognize that the lack of diversity and inclusion in the development drug process is detrimental to communities. And we also know that it doesn't just apply to race and ethnicity, which some people like to naturally assume. It also includes age and gender and socioeconomic status and even disease states. So the goal of this session is to provide education and awareness while highlighting effective solutions to achieve health equity. We're joined here today by an esteemed group of panelists who have worked tirelessly. I mean, they have been in the trenches to bridge the gaps of health inequity and to help drive those long-term changes that we are hoping to accomplish. And as we go through this discussion, again, feel free to type in questions in the chat and we'll review those questions during the audience Q&A. So I'd like to start our conversation with Rear Admiral Sharday Arojo. She's the Associate Commissioner for Minority Health and the Director of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And of note, we are extremely grateful for the work of the FDA right now. And we appreciate her taking the time out of her busy schedule, because we know it's busy, to speak with us today. So Sade, tell us a little bit about yourself and the FDA's efforts around health equity.
Thank you so much, Vicki. It is truly a pleasure and honor to be able to participate on this panel for this extremely important conversation. And to provide a little bit of background, I'm Barbara Shardy-Arrojo. Of course, I'm Associate Commissioner for Minority Health and Director of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at FDA. And I'm a pharmacist by training. I've been at FDA for 17 years. It's amazing how fast time flies. And I'm just really excited to be able to lead the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. The FDA established the Office of Minority Health in 2010. And we were renamed to the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity in 2019. And we are very excited about our new name because we really think it helps to highlight the scope of the work that our office has historically performed and what we are continuing to do, which is working to protect and promote the health of racial and ethnic minorities, underrepresented and underserved populations by focusing our efforts on research and outreach and communication that works towards addressing health disparities. So we are an office that is dedicated to addressing health disparities. And I think that is very important when we think about clinical trial diversity in the conversation that we're going to have today. Our office sits within the Office of the Commissioner at FDA, and we work broadly across our agency. FDA is a large agency. We are focused on many different product areas and a range of different regulatory authorities that we oversee. And our office has three overarching goals. We aim to improve regulatory science by increasing data available in the populations that we serve. We, of course, aim to strengthen FDA's ability to respond to minority health concerns, as well as promote health and safety communication to populations that may experience low health literacy, speak English as a second language, or not at all. So with our mission, one of the ways that we are able to, of course, achieve that mission is through across two key programmatic areas. So we have a research and collaboration program that works to support and fund health equity and minority health focused research so that we can really continue to understand and address the gaps and health disparities. We also have an internship and fellowship program, which we think is really important because we always want to be able to continue to provide training. And we have our outreach and communication program. And this program, I think, has been critically important, especially during COVID-19, where we are working to improve FDA's communications to the populations that we serve. And we do that through a variety of different culturally and linguistically tailored programs, initiatives, and campaigns. One of those, of course, which is a key priority area for our office, is our Diversity in Clinical Trials initiative. We also have our language access program. We really work to make sure that we are communicating across all of our program areas, all of our tools and resources in multiple languages. And we're also trying to make sure that we have diverse ways to reach the diverse consumers that we serve. So social media outreach, we of course have newsletters, our website. And another area for us that's really important, and we heard this at the very beginning remarks, is collaborations and partnerships. We know that when you're working in the space of health disparities, we cannot do this work alone. So collaborations and partnerships are critically important for us. And especially when we talk about working to advance diverse participation in clinical trials, which, as I mentioned, is a priority for us. It's something that we've been working to address for a number of years, because we know that people of different ages, races, and ethnicities may react differently to medical products. And our goal is that participants in clinical trials will reflect the diversity of those that are ultimately going to use the product, so that we can analyze that data and communicate meaningful information to the public. So I am really just pleased to be able to be a part of this panel and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Admiral. That is excellent to hear about the expansive work that the FDA is doing. I mean, it's quite impressive, and looking forward to hearing more as we proceed through this session. So now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Latasha Lee, and she's the Vice President of Social and Clinical Research and Development with the National Minority Quality Forum. And Latasha, can you share some information about yourself and the great work of the NMQF focused around disparities in healthcare.
Thank you for that introduction, Vicki, and for the opportunity to join today's discussion. As you know, the National Minority Quality Forum was established in 1998. It was one of the pivotal organizations who played a role in having April established as National Minority Health Month. And the organization came about to really address the need for um, uh, critically building infrastructure, as Admiral Arojo mentioned. It's all about partnerships to really address at the national and local level the ability to have evidence-based care, especially in communities of color who have disproportionately been impacted by a number of diseases. And to address this disproportionate burden by allowing the opportunity for NMQF's data resources to inform not only the care, but also the science and the role of clinical trials in their care. And so I joined the National Minority Quality Forum in August of this year. It seems like this year is passing so fast. So August of this year as VP of Research and Development, where we are building our efforts to really address the need for minority participation in clinical trials.
Excellent, excellent. And we work closely with the NMQF as well at Novartis. And again, the work that you all are doing is incredibly important. And last but not least is Stephanie Loomer. And she is the project manager and research scientist with the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, CISCRIP. And Stephanie, can you tell us about yourself and the work of CISCRIP?
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you for it's a mouthful for sure. That I do work for CISCRIP. For short, we are an independent nonprofit organization founded nearly 2 decades ago, and we're dedicated to educating and informing the public, patients, medical and research communities, the media, and policymakers about clinical research and the role each party plays in that process. So we provide a lot of services, one of them being we help patients and others locate ongoing trials. And we really try to also honor those who have participated in clinical research because none of us would be here without the volunteers that give their time to clinical trials. So that's always been a really important aspect for us. And like Vicki mentioned, I am a project manager specifically for the Research Services Department. And what we do is we conduct research studies for organizations, both for-profit and not-for-profit, and companies to better understand public and patient perceptions, motivations, and experiences with clinical research. And the people we talk to are patients and caregivers across the world and across all therapeutic areas. So we've really been able to connect people with one another, but also create somewhat of a bridge between sponsoring companies as well as patients and their caregivers. And CISCRIP also provides additional education and creates materials really catered towards patients, trying to make it as user-friendly as possible to make education and those opportunities more available to all types of communities.
Excellent, fantastic. That's just great to hear all the robust work that's being done in this area. And so now we're going to delve deeper into our discussion with some questions for our panelists on health equity and disparities. And I'd like to start with Latasha. So Latasha, clinical trials is obviously going to be a large part of today's discussion. But before we get into it further, can you kind of lay out the foundation of describing health equity in its entirety? And I touched a little bit on it broadly, but if you can share a little bit more details on health equity, because we understand diversity and inclusion in clinical trials is incredibly important, but that's one part. We have to strive for health equity. So if you can touch on that, that would be helpful for our attendees.
Sure. So let's level set for our, audience here. So health equity is truly defined as the absence or unfair and avoidable, remediable differences in health among various populations. And we start looking at populations, they can be defined either socially, economically, demographically, geographically, and also racially. And so as we start talking about diversity in participation in clinical trials, this really becomes evident that there's need for additional equity. If I could have my first slide, please. So this particular slide is really highlighting some efforts by the U.S. Census back in 2010. I know we're in the midst of a revamp of the census, the 2020 census, but the 2010 census really provided us a peek at our nation's changing racial and ethnic diversity, and is really a snapshot as well as a projection of the racial changes that we are experiencing in this nation. It shows us that racial groups, especially individuals by age, is differing across the projections from 2012 to 2060, where in the red line you're seeing individuals who are under age 18, and in the darker blue line you're seeing the total population. And what this examination really shows us is that racial and ethnic group distributions nationally, while it still shows that non-Hispanic white alone are numerically the highest population at this point, but the growth is actually a little stagnated because this particular group is having the slowest rate of growth. And what you see highlighted in this first box, the blue box, is that minority participation is projected to become the majority of the population of individuals under age 18 in 2018. And if you take a peek at drug trials in this same year, 4 years prior in 2014, many of the drug trials really are looking at that baseline age of around 45 years of age. And so with this changing demographics of the United States, it's really important for us to look at where our country is going. In fact, the projections say that the minority population is projected to become the numerical majority of the total population in 2043. So it's really important for us to look at minority participation, especially in this emerging drug market.
And that's so important, Latasha. And I don't think people are quite aware of those changing demographics and the implications to access for medicine. So thank you so much for sharing that information.
Thank you.
And again, for our attendees, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We will be having a Q&A session to, ask our panelists questions. So the next question is for Stephanie. Why are including diverse volunteers so important to the clinical research process? And I mean, we're seeing data that Latasha put before us, but can you describe why that is important, and then also what that process looks like? Because what we're hearing as a result of the vaccines, people are now really wondering, what are studies and what's the process, and are they inclusive of the demographics of America? And so if you can share that process with us, I think that would be extremely helpful.
Absolutely, Vicki, thank you. And jumping off of what you just said, right? So we think about people are wondering about the vaccine, and is it inclusive? Is it being tested on people that look like them? And that's what's most important here. That's what's really needs to be captured in clinical trials. So it's critical to engage those who will be using a product once it's on the market. So the vaccine, right, is we hope everyone gets it, right? But we also think about conditions that directly or have a greater impact on certain communities, whether that's older populations, race and ethnicity. And it's impossible to know what that's going to look like if those individuals aren't engaged in clinical trials. And I think there's another piece here. Engaging those individuals in clinical trials also means we can think about and begin to be sensitive to social and cultural norms as well involved in that process. So we really get to learn more about these communities and what clinical trials mean to them. And so from our perspective, it's really about building a bridge between these communities and sponsoring companies and even healthcare, right? So the health equity is a really challenging topic, right? So we want to begin to build that bridge and make it a safe space for everyone. And like Vicki said, I'd love to, if you could pull up the video, really share what the clinical research process looks like. This is a high-level overview, but really to set the stage a little bit more about the conversation. So you can go ahead and play that.
People around the world are becoming more aware of new therapies that are being developed. These therapies, such as drugs and vaccines, are developed through clinical trials. All clinical trials begin with a question that scientists, including doctors and disease experts, want to answer. To do this, scientists prepare a development plan based on early studies done in the lab. Next, researchers submit a request to regulatory and government agencies, like the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, to begin testing a new therapy in people. Once this request is approved, researchers seek volunteers to participate in clinical trials. The success of these trials depends on including a diverse group of people representative of those who may be treated by the new therapy if it is approved for use. There are 4 phases of clinical trials. During phase 1, a new therapy is given to a small group of participants. The goals are to check the safety, find a safe dose, and track any medical problems. During phase 2, researchers check the therapy's safety and how it works in participants with a specific disease or condition. During phase 3, researchers check the therapy's safety and how well it works in a larger group of people with a specific medical condition. Phase 4 trials happen after a therapy has been approved and made available to the public. Researchers look at how the therapy works in the real world and its long-term effects. This whole process could take over 8 years, and vaccine development typically takes even longer because there are more safety tests. This development process is important because it's the best way to ensure that the safest, most effective therapies reach the public.
Thank you. And that video will be available after to everyone if you're interested in watching it again. But really that last piece there, they want to make sure that it's the safest and most effective medications. And we can't do that without having diverse communities involved in clinical trials. I'll turn it back to you, Vicki.
Absolutely, Stephanie. And Latasha, I think you have additional information to weigh in.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think it's really important for us to begin to look at some of the barriers to clinical trial participation, in particular when you look at communities of color. What are some of the challenges that they face, and what are some of the things that we can do as a population? I think partners in this space, whether it's our federal partners like Admiral Orojo, or our nonprofit organizations like NMQF and SysScript, as well as our partners in industry and academia who are involved here. I spent some time with the sickle cell community in my prior job and understanding what their needs are. For those of you not familiar with sickle cell actually primarily affects communities of color. And some of the things that we witnessed there are challenges in access to clinical trials. And it's truly important to understand those barriers. If I could have my next slide, please. So it's really important to understand why we see gaps in participation, whether it's racial or ethnic. And if you take a look at this snapshot provided by the FDA for their 2015 to 2019 drug trial snapshots report, you see that the overwhelming majority of the racial contributions of participants is primarily Caucasians or white, whereby the minority participation, which is that little small pie piece, is really the minority participation, where African American Blacks account for, on average between these 5 years, about 6% of the population, Asian Americans 10%, Hispanics 12%, and then other at 4%. Native American is an area which we really truly need to make additional impact. When you didn't take a look at ethnicity distribution, the majority are not Hispanic or Latinx. And so despite our efforts to truly address equity in clinical trials, there are truly challenges to participation that we must address to ensure that there is participation by underrepresented minorities. Some of those solutions truly involve a listening to the community, because they are experts not only in their disease, but their lived experience of the disease. Understanding that not all clinical trials should take place at academic medical centers. While this is the go-to for clinical trials, this is often not where these minority individuals reside. It's really important to also understand their needs, why this gap exists. Is it that we have implicit bias within our own healthcare system, whereby individuals who are involved in the clinical decisions of involving individuals in clinical trials have their own biases, thinking that individuals aren't interested? In fact, research done by Syscript as well as Research America has shown that minority participants are interested in clinical trials, but the fact is they're never asked. I'll turn things back over. I know there's probably a lot of comments and remarks to this particular slide.
Yes, yes, and I know Admiral Arojo may want to jump in as well, but I do appreciate the fact that you define many of those barriers, but also looked at sickle cell disease, because I think sometimes when people discuss health inequities, they're not real clear in explaining what that looks like, and that's a disease area where you can literally look at multiple policies that are in place where there are disparities. And so thank you for bringing that up. And Admiral Rojo, did you want to jump in this discussion?
Sure, Vicki. And I think Latasha really just hit it spot on. We know that minorities are willing to participate, and often they aren't asked. And I can add some additional information to the drug trial snapshots report that recently came out. So our Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA developed our drug trial snapshots program, and they lead that program. And drug trial snapshots provide information to consumers about those that participated in clinical trials that supported FDA approval for new drugs. And you can find information on a particular new drug. The center also puts out yearly summary reports. And of course, this is the most recent data that we have from CDER, which is the 5-year overview of drug trial snapshots information. And I think what we see, the information that Latasha presented, is that aggregate reporting across both US and global. So those are our numbers across all of the trials collectively. And I did want to just present some information specific to US participants. So within that same report, we also have information for just the US participation. And what we saw was that for Black or African American, we had about 16% representation. For Asian, we had about 2%. For American Indian, Alaska Native, about 1%. And for Hispanics, we had about 15%. And when you start to do even a deeper dive to that data, what we see is while we're making progress in some areas, there are specific areas with regard to, for example, cardiovascular disease, oncology, and other diseases and conditions where we still have a lot of work to do as far as advancing diverse participation.
That's great to hear. And let me emphasize to everyone that many of these resources will be made available. So the things that we're discussing, the reports and the video, the YouTube, will be made available through BioNJ. Okay. Thank you, Admiral Arojo. So one additional question for you, Latasha. When we talk about all these clinical trial areas and efforts, are there other efforts that you feel need to be addressed?
Thank you so much for that, Vicki. I think this is it's pieces of a puzzle, as I like to call it. I think of all of us playing our unique role in this process, and I found this really interesting graphic. If I could have the next slide, I think it really addresses some of the things that we're seeing. In order to diversify clinical trials, we need to look at the barriers. So not only the barriers that happen for individuals who have cancer, but collectively as a whole, and then parsing that out because every disease state, individual and patient is not the same and their needs may vary. So addressing barriers is not a one-stop shop. It can't go across the board. But additionally, why is diversity so important? Diversity is important because all drugs are not metabolized and received well by the same populations. There are great examples of this, and we can probably drop some of those down into the comment box, especially around cardiovascular disease and other diseases. I think it's important for us also to look at data collection and analysis considerations. While we do have, information around participation right now, who's collecting the data? How is that data being disseminated to the individuals who are part of this clinical trials? While we talk about the importance of returning results to individuals, oftentimes that stigma of being part of being a guinea pig and not knowing what's actually happening to them and how their data is being utilized is important. And then I think it's really important for us to look at case studies of what's worked and what's not worked to understand in the future what we can do differently. And I really would love to bring together a roundtable of individuals to have further discussions around this from both academia as well as the pharma and biopharmaceutical side, to really understand best practices. We all talk about what works within our own organizations and systems, but I think it's important for us to level set and understand truly what are some things that are cross-cutting that we can all do to ensure that there's diversity, inclusion, but also equity. And then we start talking about the role of genomics in general in clinical trials. You know, there is a lot of diversity in our own genomes. And so it's important for us to begin to understand how that impacts the participation in clinical trials, especially as you consider the exclusion and exclusion criteria. And genomics will really help us get to the point where we can have precision medicine for individuals.
Excellent, excellent. And all of those, the data data has always been a challenge, right? And now we're starting to, mine that data to be able to make those decisions and then come together, as you indicated, with a roundtable of all different stakeholders to say, now what are we going to do? And how are we going to get it done? Appreciate that. Maybe that's a next step that we look at moving forward from this meeting. So I'm going to shift back to Admiral Arojo again and just ask, would you like to share a little bit more again on what the FDA continues to do? I mean, you've laid out a number of aspects of the work that's being done, but can you share anything additional with us?
Sure. FDA has long worked to advance diverse participation in clinical trials. We've hosted public meetings. We've developed tools as well as issuing guidance documents. So I guess I'll start with the guidance documents first and just highlight the most recent guidance document that the agency issued. This was a guidance that was first issued as a draft last year, and most recently the final guidance document came out last month, and it's on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations, eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, and trial designs. I think this guidance continues to highlight FDA's commitment to advancing clinical trial diversity. It provides our current thinking on steps to broaden eligibility criteria through inclusive trial practices, trial designs, methodological approaches. It also talks about recommendations for sponsors to increase enrollment of underrepresented populations, as well as ways that we can continue to work to improve trial recruitment so that participants enrolled in trials reflect the population most likely to use the drug if that drug is approved, while of course maintaining safety and effectiveness standards. And the other areas, of course, as I mentioned, developing tools, public meetings, and the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, we developed our Diversity in Clinical Trials initiative. And this is an initiative that has been ongoing for a number of years. And it also includes an ongoing multimedia public education and outreach campaign, where we really work to address some of the barriers preventing diverse groups from participating in clinical trials through a range of culturally and linguistically competent strategies, tools, and resources. And some of those are educational materials in multiple languages that highlight the value of clinical trial participation. And the other part for us that's really important is that we just provide just the general basic information of what is a clinical trial, what does it mean to participate, and why is it important for us to have diverse participation, and where you can find additional information. We have public service announcements, we have videos, all in multiple languages. We engage in social media outreach. We have ongoing efforts to engage different communities and health professionals. And the one area that I can't stress enough that is so very important for us is close collaboration. We work to develop collaborations and engage across public and private sector stakeholders, across government, academia, industry, among others, so that we can continue to raise awareness on how critically important it is for us to have diverse participation. And I will mention one of our most recent resources that we developed is on medical device clinical trials. And it highlights what those trials are and why it's important for us to have diverse participation in those trials. So we are always working to add new resources, and we have a dedicated webpage that houses all of the information that I just mentioned. And we are, again, I think just to kind of close it out, again, for us, it's just really partnerships and collaborations and sharing of best practices so that we can continue to advance diverse participation.
This is so exciting. Thank you so much for sharing all of that work. I don't know that everyone knows how much work is being done by the FDA and other stakeholders. And so now it's incredibly important for us to make this information to help support your efforts and raise awareness of the resources that are available, but to come together and, as discussed, share those best practices. So thank you for that. And Stephanie, we haven't forgotten about you. We want to talk a little bit about the patient, right? So as we discuss all the different stakeholders that are working to raise this awareness, provide resources to educate, to be transparent, what are some additional ways that patients can be better engaged in the clinical trial process? Because they're asking, what do I need to do? How can I be an active participant? Because it is important for them to play a major role.
Absolutely. And there are so many ways to go about it. And I think that's part of the thing that we need to spread that information, right? So we can think about, you can get involved in a clinical trial, which is fantastic. And we love that volunteers give their time and their efforts, and that's amazing. It's also attending things like this, like a summit, and learning more about opportunities and making connections. It's being a patient advocate. So for all of you on the line who are advocates, also, thank you so much for the work that you do. Attending webinars, doing patient advisory boards, which Syscript does host, and there are other companies that do the same to learn, again, more about perceptions and experiences. And other conferences and summits, and speaking on your own experience, either as an advocate or as a patient. And I think all of that comes together. And, people like Latasha or Admiral Arojo use that information and to better build materials and better engage individuals. And it's really learning about communities and how they want to be engaged. So it's about getting out there and really taking hold of some of those opportunities.
Great. That's great recommendation for those who want to be a part of this process, this very, very important process. Thank you for that, Stephanie. So Latasha, with the advent of vaccines, hoping to have the approval soon, there are a lot of myths and misinformation out there, particularly around clinical trials. Can you share with us and address some of those myths when it comes to recruitment of diverse patient populations and just the challenges of being well informed?
I really want to applaud and echo some of the things that, Admiral Rojo as well as Stephanie mentioned. Both of their organizations institutions have really done a lot to do education around clinical trials. And particularly, Syscript has a myths document, which I've utilized a lot in my education of the sickle community and other minority communities around clinical trial participation. One of the biggest ones I've heard is being a guinea pig. And I'm a bench scientist by training. My PhD is in molecular neuroscience. And there are actually guinea pigs, quote unquote, lab mice and rats that actually, other animal models in which research happens before it actually comes to humans. And I think that's important for people to know. We don't talk about it enough to our broader public, but it's important for them to know that while we say first in human, there were other animal species in which many drugs have gone through before it actually comes to you as a clinical trial participant. And I think that's the biggest one I hear. The second is that they don't trust the system. And, this is a myth, and this is a myth on the part of the healthcare system. We're currently doing a clinical research study of COVID-19 in federally qualified health centers. And the important thing here, for those of you who know federally qualified health centers, is that these are institutions established and clinics established by our federal government and provide funding for, especially through HRSA, to allow individuals who do not have care to receive care despite their ability to pay. And through relationships with the doctors at these clinics, these are seen as trusted partners because this is where many of these people receive care. And so it's through that trusted relationship we've actually seen success in being able to enroll participants in a long-term study of COVID-19's impact in communities of color. And so there isn't a lack of trust. We have to get that implicit bias out of the minds of our healthcare system and have real, honest, frank, and candid conversations around clinical trial participation. We also know that oftentimes there is a challenge in our healthcare system whereby individuals who are not cared for by individuals who are of color oftentimes face poor outcomes. There's been a lot of data around the concordance or the similarity in racial background between a participant, a patient, and their caregiver. And it's important for us to really address that particular issue by having more minority clinicians, investigators, and healthcare workers work in clinical trials to help build additional trust moving forward. And so those are three myths I'd like to highlight, but I'm sure the other panelists have a few that they would like to share, possibly.
Yes, I'll ask our other panelists, jump right on in as far as some myths that you've heard, if they are different than what Latasha has indicated.
I think I can simply echo the guinea pig myth, right? So a lot of people do, even if that's not their actual perception, it's certainly, there's a stigma around participating in clinical trials only because there's this understanding that you're going to be poked and prodded, which in some clinical trials is the case. However, it's really about learning more about what's actually going to be involved. And, that's on part of the sponsoring companies as well, to have that transparency and communication and really putting it out there. This is exactly what's going to happen. And that also touches on the myth of a lack of trust, right? It's not necessarily a lack of trust. It's a lack of understanding. And that's a two-way street, right? It has to be that level of communication.
Agreed. And Amaral, is there any other feedback you'd like to add on that? Because I tell you, when you talk to people in our communities, they can say all different type of things around why they won't participate in clinical trials, and then the mistrust. And again, it's a lot due to the lack of transparency and understanding and education. Any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I think that there is a true need, which is, of course, even the campaign that I highlighted and the efforts that Latasha and Stephanie mentioned. Education is really important. We need to make sure that our communities have accurate and current information to understand what it really means as far as participation in a clinical trial. And I think the efforts for community engagement and making sure that you're working with trusted leaders in the community, making sure that you're kind of having that consistent bi-directional community engagement. You're not stepping in for one trial and stepping out. So I think building those relationships is very important, but also making sure that we have accurate and current information so you can make an informed decision. I
agree. Very good. And I'll keep the next question with you, our last question before we open it up to our audience. Can you describe, because we talked a little bit about best practices, and you've laid out a number of areas that you all are working in and things that you have done successfully, it sounds like, but can you discuss some of your work with OMHHE and the stakeholder engagement? Because again, we're hearing a lot about collaboration, different stakeholders working together, coming to define solutions, coming together. So if you can share a little bit about that, that would be extremely helpful.
Sure. So we have a number of stakeholder engagement activities, and I'll highlight just a few of them. This is by far not all of the areas that we engage. One of our engagements is with the Alliance of Multicultural Physicians, and we actually have a memorandum of understanding with them. And this is a collective of the 5 major national minority physician associations, including the Association of American Indian Physicians, Association of Black Cardiologists, National Medical Association, among others. And one of our key priorities with that MOU is to work to advance diverse participation in clinical trials. And this is just a huge opportunity for us because of the populations that they serve, and we're able to really get good feedback from them and work to continue to our efforts to advance diverse participation in clinical trials. Another memorandum of understanding that we have is with Yale University, and this is specifically with their Cultural Ambassador Program, where they have established a long trusted relationship with community partners, and they have really been successful in advancing their diversity in their trials. So we are working with them as well. We participated on the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center in Harvard Diversity Work Group, and they most recently released their Achieving Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity in Clinical Research Diversity Framework. And the other thing that I'll mention, and I'll mention it specific to this engagement, is that we also want to make sure we're trying to work to advance diverse participation, raise awareness, education. These are groups that have had broad stakeholders at the table. But the other part to this is making sure that when we have the information that we can appropriately analyze it. So we actually held a meeting with them that was focused on heterogeneity of treatment effects so that we can continue to advance our innovations in actually analyzing the data. Another project that we're engaged in is the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative Diversity Project, and City, which is Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. They're a public-private partnership that's co-founded by Duke University and FDA. But the other part to this that I just want to mention is, again, these are just some of our more formal collaborations, but we work collectively across academia with HBCUs, with others, so that we can really extend our reach, make sure that our resources that we've developed are disseminated, that they can be used. We have people that reach out. We ship our information. We're happy to provide copies of all of our fact sheets, brochures. So we always want to be able to extend that reach. And the other part that I will just mention that I think is just so important is making sure that we have that consistent, continued bi-directional community engagement by working with cultural ambassadors, faith-based organizations, trusted leaders in the community, because we know that those efforts support diversity in clinical trials.
Very good. Thank you so much. I mean, you've laid out a footprint of areas and opportunities for many of us to consider and move forward. This has been great. So we have a little bit of time to answer a few more questions from our audience. And so I'm going to pose these questions to all of our panelists, and feel free to jump in. One of the first questions that we have, and this has come up before, why is it that Medicaid does not cover routine costs? And I'm not sure if you all can answer this, but hopefully you can. Why is it that Medicaid does not cover routine costs for Medicaid patients enrolled in clinical trials? And would requiring Medicaid to do so improve the participation in clinical trials? So is this a question that
I can take a stab at this.
Natasha.
So the National Minority Quality Forum, as you know, has a comprehensive database consisting of about 5 billion patient records, which it uses to define prevalence of disease, costs, et cetera. But what our data really shows is that nearly a quarter, it's more like 20% of Americans receive their healthcare insurance through state Medicaid programs. Interestingly, my father was a former state legislator in Florida, and the challenge with state Medicaid programs is that it's always balancing the book every year. And the challenge with that is that various states have, different revenue streams, and unfortunately, they have to make the tough decision in terms of Medicaid coverage for certain things. So yes, unlike Medicare and private commercial payers, Medicaid is not federally required to cover routine care costs for clinical trials by patients. There are, however, several states, I believe the count was something around 15 or 20 states, do have options for their Medicaid programs to cover these costs, but there are over, nearly 40 million some odd patients who are potentially without receiving, the opportunity to have Medicaid covered. I did spend some time on Capitol Hill as a policy advisor in healthcare, and I do continue to follow legislation. There actually is a piece of legislation out in this current Congress, the 2019 to 2020 Congress, that looks to expand this to have a federal legislation or bill to require that state programs cover routine patient costs for services in connection with their care for clinical trials if they have cancer or other life-threatening conditions.
Very good. Thank you. That is extremely helpful. And many of us are aware of the concerns around states not covering Medicaid. And so thank you for expanding that discussion. The next question we have is broad outreach and generating awareness about the importance of diversity in clinical research for common disorders is advancing, yet still challenging. And for rare diseases with extremely small patient population numbers, achieving awareness for increased diversity is far more difficult. So this question is for Admiral Araujo. How does the FDA think about this when looking at diversity that may or may not be obtained in the rare disease clinical research?
I think that's a really good question. And we know that, and I can even think about just some of our engagements with rare disease organizations. Again, we work broadly with our stakeholders, patient advocacy organization and others. And sometimes some of the feedback we hear too is just simply even those, the recruitment materials, when you can't even read kind of the first line of it, you don't understand that first line, that almost, you're not even going to move forward to learn more. And we've heard a lot about that even within the rare disease space, about how we can continue to work to make sure that we have materials, and that we are engaging the community. So we're educating so that we can raise awareness about why it's important for those with rare diseases to participate and be involved in clinical trials as well. So I think our strategy is also making sure that we're engaging with those organizations that are experts in that space so that we can extend our reach, we can increase the education and advance participation.
Very good. Thank you for that. There are a couple more questions that I really think we should, I know we have about 5 more minutes, but one, is there a role for employers, okay, to plan in providing information and or time off when workers are looking to participate in clinical trials? Any discussions around that with our panelists? With, as we think about some of the collaborative efforts, have we included employers in that conversation? And should we?
From our perspective, I mean, that's a need or a desire from a lot of people when they think about clinical trial participation, even if it comes down to flexibility and scheduling of their visits for a clinical trial. So while I can't speak on behalf of an employer, I think just Sarah, so that you know that, I mean, that's a desire for a lot of people, and I certainly think it needs to be on the table as a possibility.
Okay, thank you for that. And someone made a note, it is a happy coincidence with this discussion and our Patient Advocacy Summit that today Henrietta Lacks will be inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame. And so I know most of us know that story, but if you don't, you need to do a little research and learn about what happened with Henrietta Lacks. And then one question came up for you, Latasha, if you could maybe provide the bill number for the Medicaid legislation.
I will drop that into the chat box.
Thank you. And so as we wrap up, is there any last one short line comment that you would like to leave everyone with? Each of our panelists. And we can start with Stephanie.
Thank you. I think overall, panelists, first off, thank you so much for all the work that you do and for attending this summit. And I think it's important that you seek out opportunities, and we don't want to put the responsibility on you, but I think you're the first line of defense in this discussion. And thank you so much for taking the time to learn a little bit more from all of us today.
Great. And Latasha?
Apologies, I was typing the bill in the comment. So, I wanted to say that I echo what Stephanie mentioned. We have to really pay a debt to the participants who contribute not only their time, but their resources. And Vicki, as you highlighted, Henrietta Lacks. I had no idea who Henrietta Lacks was until I was doing my PhD, and I had been working on HeLa cells for all those years. And it's individuals who have dedicated their lives, their resources, their bodily fluids, and their organs that we truly must applaud during this effort. And I think the last thing for our investigators and researchers and biopharma, remember that participation is local and that you have to make local efforts to include diverse individuals. And it can't be a real blanketed, approach, that you have to look at those unique situations and barriers at the local level.
Thank you for that, Latasha. And the last 30 seconds, we'll turn it over to Admiral Arojo.
Thank you. I just want to, of course, say thank you for just the opportunity to be here and participate. And the one thing that I think is just so important when we talk about clinical trials, we need to remember why we are conducting those trials. And at the very, very beginning, the patient needs to be in mind. And at the very end, the patient needs to be in mind. So we need to continue our efforts to raise awareness, to engage patients, to make sure that as we move forward, our trials can be diverse and that they are meeting the needs of our patients.
Thank you so much. I applaud all of our panelists. I applaud BioNJ, and thank you for having this robust discussion. And I am going to turn it over now to Randy to take us to the next steps. Thank you all for this.
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you to our amazing panelists. This is such an important topic. Hi, I'm Randy Bromberg, Vice President of Communications and Marketing for BioNJ, and I couldn't be more excited for this year's summit. As you just saw, we have an amazing group of experts with us today, and this is just the beginning. And as Vicki and a number of our panelists had mentioned, they have put together a number of resources for us to share with all of you. And we will be doing so. We will be circulating them to all of our attendees once the meeting is over, as well as putting them on our website at bionj.org. As we know, moving legislative initiatives forward can be very challenging and often quite intimidating, especially in the day and age of COVID and having a virtual environment. With the onset of COVID, many of us have had to rethink our methodologies and redefine our campaign strategies and techniques. However, we have a panel with us today who's going to help show us how to turn these challenges into opportunities. And using step therapy as a case study, we're going to hear how to model advocacy in the age of COVID. To lead this discussion, please welcome my colleague and good friend, John Slotman, Vice President of Government Affairs for BioNJ. Thanks, John. Take it away.
Thank you, Randy, and good morning, everyone. That was a terrific discussion we just heard, and thank you so much to Vicki and our panelists for that. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to be moderating the Engage portion of our summit today with a panel on advocacy in the age of COVID-19. Let's set the stage a little bit, and I think we all kind of know what's going on out there. The pandemic has changed so much of our lives, how we shop for groceries. I haven't been to a grocery store since March. How we dine at a restaurant. For those of us with school-age children, in-person or remote schooling, there's just so many different ways that our lives have been affected these last 9 months, and the list goes on. And I can confirm from personal experience that COVID has also changed exactly how we do advocacy. No longer are we meeting with our legislators in a house or a Senate office building or in the annex in Trenton, for those of us who've been held remotely via Zoom. Town halls, BioNJ has had a number of town halls, a number of briefings, a number of other events and meet and greet meetings and committee meetings. Everything continues to be done virtually. Like so much of our other parts of our lives in 2020 is really transitioned to a remote format. So how can advocates best meet the challenge of this transition to virtual advocacy? What we have learned are best practice, what have we learned are the best practices for engagement during these last 9 months? How do we get our advocates engaged in virtual grassroots efforts in policy and advocacy? Thankfully, I'm really excited that we do have an exceptional panel with us today to answer these important questions, using legislative efforts here in New Jersey on appropriate use of step therapy to guide us. So why don't we get started? And first, I'm very excited to introduce Mara Bro. Mara is the Senior Manager of Advocacy for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. Mara, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you quickly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your organization? Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Good morning. My name is Mara Bro, and I'm a Senior Advocacy Manager for the National MS Society. So for a little background information, MS is an unpredictable, often disabling disease of the central nervous system that disrupts the flow of information within the brain and between the brain and body. Symptoms vary widely from person to person and range from numbness and tingling to walking difficulties, fatigue, dizziness, pain, depression, and even blindness and paralysis. The progress and severity of specific symptoms of MS in any one person cannot yet be predicted, but advances in research and treatment are leading to a better understanding and moving us closer to a world free of MS. We know that nearly 1 million people in the US and 2.3 million worldwide are currently living with MS. And here at the MS Society, our mission is that people affected by MS can live their best lives as we stop MS in its tracks, restore what has been lost, and end MS forever. And one of the ways we work to fulfill our mission is through our advocacy work, and that is where I come in. In my role as a Senior Advocacy Manager, I work to advance the Society's advocacy priorities and engage and cultivate activists. I currently cover the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Indiana. We have a wide range of priorities, including many that are focused on access to and affordability of MS medication, including the issue of step therapy. I work in coalitions with other patient advocacy groups on these issues, as well as working directly with legislative offices to try to advance legislation. And another important part of my job is working with our patient advocates or our activists. And since March, all of this work has been done virtually. So I personally have done some virtual advocacy, and I've done a lot of work to help our activists engage virtually. So again, I'm really happy to be here this morning to talk to you all about this important issue.
Thank you, Mara. And next we have Ben Chandok with us from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. Ben serves as the State Government Affairs Director for the Eastern Region for Bio and has been a great partner since starting with Bio earlier in this year. Ben, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this panel and this great event that you're hosting. As John mentioned, my name is Ben Chandok. I'm the State Government Affairs Director for the Eastern Region of Bio, the National Biotechnology Trade Association. But previously, you may know me from the Arthritis Foundation. Before I came to Bio in August, I spent 4 years at the Arthritis Foundation working on very similar issues as Mara and the MS Society, including step therapy here in New Jersey.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. And again, thank you so much for being here today. And of course, we are joined by Assemblyman Herb Conaway. Assemblyman Conaway, as we know, serves as the chair of the Health Committee in our New Jersey General Assembly, and he's also represented New Jersey's 7th legislative district since 1998. I might add that I'm born and raised in the 7th legislative district, so always exciting to have Assemblyman Conaway with us. He also serves on the Science, Innovation, and Technology Committee, a committee our innovative life sciences companies know well, and the Appropriations Committee. Mr. Chairman, we're so excited that we have you with us today, and we really appreciate you taking the time. As you know, many of our audience tuned in to see A4815 pass through your committee back in October. And we're really thankful for your continued leadership on ensuring patient access to the treatments that they need when they need it most, such as the step therapy legislation. First things first, what's the status of the step therapy legislation, and how can our patient advocates be a resource as this bill continues to work its way through the process?
Well, good morning, and thanks. I'm very pleased to spend some time with you discussing what's good for healthcare, our patients here in New Jersey. I've been pleased to be involved with the health policy in New Jersey for a number of years now, and remain a practicing physician, and so I keep my finger on the pulse of as much as I can on the various healthcare issues that affect the people I'm privileged to represent. The step therapy bill is something that in my practice I've seen. It's been an issue that has rightfully concerned people for a long time, and this vehicle which has broad support among advocates and among physicians and others involved in the healthcare system, hopefully will propel it into being. It's passed through my committee, as you're aware. It is my counterpart in the Senate, Senator Vitale, is the prime sponsor there, and I'll be advocating with him to get it heard in his committee, and I believe that it will enjoy the bipartisan support in the Senate Health Committee that it enjoyed in the Assembly Health Committee, and then we can get it moved on to the increased attention in the front office. So I know you're talking about advocacy, and right now one of the first steps have been done. We volleyed over to the Senate. And let's get them going. I believe it'll be well received there. And so your cards and letters and phone calls, kind and gentle calls, letters, and phone calls to the senator's office, to his staff, will be helpful in that. But we speak on a regular basis, And as our schedules permit, I would expect to see that it will not be too long before a very fine bill such as this, if I may say, will be received and heard in the Senate Health Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate that, and already getting a few chats in the chat box here, thanking you for your advocacy on this. So, you know, our patients are certainly enthusiastic for this effort, and, you know, stand willing and ready to be a resource as much as possible. So I guess, you know, I'd ask you, Mr. Chairman, you know, we've been doing this for 9 months now or so, give or take a couple days. I kind of marked March 13th. I think that was the last day my kids went to full-time school. So that's kind of the line of demarcation here in my household in terms of, you know, when this virtual period started. But, you know, nine months in, you know, and we talked about how much everything's been done virtually, remotely, you know, whether it's your committee meetings, even back in the spring, you know, you were doing voting sessions remotely, which was, you know, an interesting thing to listen to. How have you sort of, you know, from your perspective, you know, how have you seen sort of advocacy and the, you know, the work that folks like myself and our patient groups do? How has that changed since March in these last 9 months or so?
Well, in the first instance, many of them are virtual, and one of the things that those of us who happen to have pretty heavy schedules have noted is that in many ways it's a little bit easier to get on a virtual call than it is to, you know, to establish a meeting place, you know, drive to it. Generally, you're driving to a meeting place, you know, getting a number of people together, dealing with the vagaries of traffic and physical plan, where in the virtual space, you know, it's pretty easy to get a meeting together, and there has been, you know, I would say a relaxation and sort of the meeting dress code, which I perfectly agree with. Quite frankly, I have to say I don't mind putting on a suit and tie so much, but I certainly like it better when I can get by with that one and get good work done. So I think that what people have noticed in talking to my colleagues and just people across various industries, that they're actually more meetings than people have used to have, because it's pretty easy to get one together. And so, you know, advocacy is virtual now, and with you know, a good monitor and decent lighting, you can bring not only the you know, the words of advocacy to an issue, you can also, because people can be seen, bring the emotion and the color and the, you know, the granularity to advocacy, which is often very important. We are moved by our brains, but we're also moved by our hearts, as we should be. And depending on your nature, I guess you'll lead with your heart or your head. You know, however you get there, I'm fine with it. But so advocacy is more virtual than it used to be, and that's fine. But I will tell you, most offices do monitor the mail, do monitor calls that come in. And so, you know, when you get a report at you know, the end of the week, as your staff or combined staffs get together, you know, we're seeing a lot of mail on X. There seems to be a lot of concern about Y. And so those things come in. And then, you know, as I say to people, it is that personal contact with a decision maker, which is really critical to moving something from the middle of the pile to the top of the pile. And to the extent that you can arrange for those things, not necessarily by the organized, hired lobbying staff, but by just, you know, regular folks who take the time to make an appointment. You don't need a tremendous amount of legislators' time, because it is, you know, it's a very full schedule. But grabbing somebody's attention for 10 or 15 minutes, you know, getting the high points, you know, has an impact, because, you know, people remember those things. There's a lot to in that setting that, if you will, lays on the brain and will, you know, guide the steps of people who you'll need to get, you know, good things done from a legislative point of view.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. That's some great comments. And again, we're already getting some terrific questions in through the chat. I would invite all of you, please, to submit any questions or comments you have for our panelists through the chat, and we'll try to get to them, time permitting, as we get to the end of our session. Let me turn to you, Ben. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you, though I do feel like we see each other quite often these days on various Zooms, but it's great to see you. And talk about, you cover a lot of states. I know, everybody from Maine to Alabama, right? And how have you seen, we know New Jersey and we've kind of seen what we've been doing here, but, I know a lot of other states have obviously, some of the restrictions are perhaps a little bit different. What have you seen in other states? And, how about some other states that you work in approach sort of this virtual period of advocacy?
Yeah, and I think much the same. I appreciate the chairman's comments because I think that's very similar to what other states have done. I'd say that in New Jersey, they've done a great job of posting on the website, live streams, recordings. It's easy and accessible for those that are looking from a historical and archive perspective as well as live. Other states have approached that the same way, and that has been, different, I'll say. It has not always been the case that you could watch a working group of a subcommittee of a greater committee live. I live in Maryland, here in Maryland, for any state from Maine to Alabama. That is unusual, and it's appreciated in a virtual world. I'll say that some states have moved to transcripts as well, which I think is really helpful, especially for those that may have hearing issues or otherwise. That is extremely helpful. And it's easier to find. I mean, New Jersey's on the front page. There are quite a few states that are like that as well. I'll say that from an advocacy perspective specifically, like I have noticed that there are more informational briefings from government bodies in general, both on the administration side and legislatively, which is also really appreciated. I'm not sure that it was always the case that those were broadcasted live. I can remember plenty of times at the Arthritis Foundation with 24 hours notice trying to get to Rhode Island as an example, or another state on, again, short notice to try and get to that, knowing that there wasn't going to be a live stream or a recording possible. That's just an example, but I think overall it has made government proceedings more open and accessible, both for advocates and the general public, which again, very much appreciated. I'll say that, echoing the chairman's comments about availability, and that a lot of legislators I've heard say something similar about how it is easier actually to meet with, because you don't have to account for travel time, for instance. You can have back-to-back, if you desire, back-to-back meetings, Zoom meetings all day if you wanted, and you can bucket them in.
Doing that now.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And 15, 30, 45-minute increments, whatever, whatever you desire, whatever your schedule permits. But, in some ways, that is a good thing, more engagement with the public, and but the legislative schedule isn't any easier. So I think, balancing that is just another challenge in a virtual environment. But without travel time, I think that from an efficiency point of view, I've heard legislators say the same thing as the chairman about, in some ways it is actually easier. The one last thing I'll say is that I think every state, again, is sort of figuring this out on their own. There was a story I was reading recently about a Massachusetts representative that was concerned a bit about how to engage constituents and advocates in general in a virtual world. They're worried about if there is only specific groups that are able to do outreach, or that she's hearing from, and not as broad an audience that she normally would in her office in the State House. And I think that is a difficulty that we're still kind of figuring out. Those live hearings and transcripts have come online fairly fast. I'll say that already in December, I can notice a tremendous difference from April and March. And so I think overall the message is that we're making progress, and in some ways it really is easier to access and engage in a virtual world.
That's great, Ben. Thank you so much. Mara, let's turn to you. Talk about, from your perspective, have you seen, are there positive for patient advocates? I know I think we've mentioned a few of them, but what are some of the ways that we've positively impacted advocacy for patient advocates in a virtual world? And then I guess the second question is, for organizations that maybe don't have access to digital advocacy platforms, how can they get their constituents to engage virtually.
So I'll echo, everything the chairman and Ben have said. While it's hard to see a lot of silver linings in anything right now, the expansion embrace of teleworking and virtual communication has really been great for our grassroots advocates. All of our patient advocates are living or caring with someone with a chronic illness or disability on top of dealing with their everyday life challenges. So getting to a district office or getting to Trenton could be very difficult for what is often a really short meeting. So now that we're able to do those virtually, it does mean that a lot more activists that had maybe wanted to participate in the past but weren't able to are able to now. Again, same with legislative hearings, specifically around step therapy, we did have a neurologist who actually leads an MS clinic testify virtually at the step therapy hearing in the assembly, and he was immediately able to go back to seeing his patients. And had that been a hearing in person and in Trenton, he definitely would not have been able to vote his whole morning or his whole day for that. And I think his testimony was really impactful and it was really important. So those are two big highlights I see. And obviously we all want to be together in the future in person, but I'm hoping that these virtual opportunities continue to exist after we can be in person safely. For the second part of your question, here at the MS Society, we are really fortunate that we do have a digital platform called Phone to Action, which we use, which does make some of our virtual advocacy a little bit easier. But there's definitely ways organizations can have their grassroots advocates or their board members, their staff engage without one. So I think there's 4 main ways they can do so. They can have a phone campaign, an email campaign, social media, or help coordinate virtual meetings. So if they're going to do this, I highly suggest creating a guide or a toolkit for your activists. And the first thing this should include is a link to the General Assembly website where they can find out exactly who their 3 New Jersey state legislators are and how to contact them. So if you're going to do an email or a phone campaign, you can actually email directly through the General Assembly website. It's very user-friendly, and you should have a sample email or talking points or script for a call. But when you're doing this, make sure that you're leaving space for personalization and that your constituents are sharing their stories and how the issue of step therapy or whatever issue it is directly affecting them and their loved ones. And also make sure you're closing with a clear and concise ask. What are you asking from our state legislators? When I do this, I think it's also really helpful to have a question and answer document with what questions you think your activists are going to receive from offices. Usually the most common ones around these issues are, what are other states doing? What other organizations are supporting this bill? We often get around the issue of step therapy or any access to medications bill. Does this only affect individuals living with MS? And I think it's really important to explain it affects all patients here in New Jersey. And having the answers prepared really helps your activists look really prepared and confident, but also helps you on the back end because you don't have to do as much follow-up with offices. It's really easy to do a social media campaign. You can do some sample posts and some sample tweets. If you're working with a large coalition, like we do have a large step therapy coalition here in New Jersey, I think it's always helpful to check with the coalition leaders to see if there's a hashtag that a lot of groups are using. So that way your posts can get lumped in with other ones. And also, I keep talking about personalization. Have your activists record a video sharing their story, sharing how difficult it is to get their medication when they have to jump through these steps, and post that. And they can even tag their legislators so they're sharing their story that way. And then finally, there are virtual meetings, and we've talked about how accessible offices have been in doing virtual meetings. And if you're going to coordinate these on a large scale, it is going to take a little bit of work on your end. You can use a script or a sample Q&A document that you would for phone calls and emails, but you might have to help coordinate a virtual platform. At this point, most offices have a preferred platform they're using, but we have had some that ask that the constituents set that up. So you might have to help do that as well. And I think it's also really important to just give some virtual best practices for a meeting. Everyone has done some kind of video call at this point, or the large majority of people have, but not everyone's working virtually. So some of these video calls they're doing might be solely on a social setting. So if it is a professional legislative meeting, you want to share some best practices around that, like being in a quiet, well-lit room, and making sure you're eliminating background clutter. I think it's really helpful to do that. So, all of these are going to require a little prep work on your behalf, but they're definitely going to pay off in the long run. Once you create the bones of a toolkit or a guide, it can easily be replicated for multiple different issues. So I highly suggest groups consider doing that.
Thanks, Mara. That's really great advice for our folks that are on the line today. So thank you so much for that perspective. Mr. Chairman, I'm thinking back to when we did have the step therapy hearing, and you also had a hearing of you also heard from some patients that day with, parents of patients with significant disabilities and some of their trials and tribulations in terms of working their way through the healthcare system. And I thought, just from my perspective, it was a really great way for, those patients were really powerful in delivering their message to you and the other members of the committee. Is that, when you're thinking about, how can patients best sort of deliver their message to in the virtual world on issues such as step therapy? I thought, like I said, I thought that was a terrific way to do it, but any other suggestions for the patient advocates we have on the line in terms of, how to best deliver their message on issues such as step therapy during the virtual, while we're in this virtual phase?
Well, that, pardon me, that particular hearing, those who testified did have a lot of challenges, physical challenges, and limitations of mobility, of course, related to that. A lot of care that needed to be delivered on a regular basis throughout the day, and so it made involvement in this space particularly difficult. But I do think that, of course, these are part, all people, particularly those, including people with disability, I should say, are part of our larger family, and we need to make sure that we are taking steps to accommodate access to the levers of government. And so that was the first sort of hearing of that kind that I had experienced, would have had it anyway, because I had committed some time to having such a hearing. And as it turns out, before the pandemic hit. And so it turns out that, the legislature and the technical staff of the legislature were able to allow or to provide a pathway for participation for those who are physically challenged. It also speaks to the issue of digital divide in general. I see a question here in the chat, and just how we, and I hope we in New Jersey are ahead of, let's say, large states out in the West that have, and rural areas that have issues with the reach of technology. I see the FCC actually just took some steps to reach rural communities across the country with access to the internet. We need, and the governor's talked about it in this setting as relates to schools, to make sure that we're doing all we can to make access to the web available to everyone, irrespective of their socioeconomic status. I think it's a very critical thing to do. I also noticed in the chat that someone mentioned about, equity considerations in legislation such as this. It made me think about, as this bill makes its way through the process, that we ought to get feedback on the decisions as respects particular groups, whether it be persons of color, whether it be persons in the LGBT community, that we should know whether or not there's any disparate treatment that results from the decisions we're requiring in this bill that insurance companies make. And that equity lens, as is mentioned in the question, I think is a very important one when issues of inclusion and fairness and fair play are quite properly ascended in our country. We need to think about that in our legislation. I think, based on that chat, we're going to try to figure out a way to manage the data that would let us see whether or not an issue of unequal treatment might arise within the context of decisions made for step therapy exceptions, by the way, or indeed, where they're applied. And so I thank you for that comment there in the chat. I'm trying to say who made it. Might be off my screen now, but here I think you've done something important, at least for me, and informed me about how we might need to change this bill. And of course, this is part of the legislative process. People bring ideas to the table. Had you considered this? Had you considered that? and we could shape legislation to get it as close as we can to something that will work as well as we would like it to.
Thank you. And that question came from our friend Dr. Adiola Shineke with the Family Resource Network, who, you know, a great patient advocate, and she submitted both those questions actually. So
thanks, Doc.
Thank you to Adiola for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ben, I think we talked a little bit about this, but, you know, in terms of how other states are sort of, you know, doing virtual meetings, virtual hearings, virtual, you know, other legislative activities. Have you seen, you know, what have you seen from other states, other organizations that you work with in terms of, you know, best advocacy practices in your perspective from some of the other states, you know, during the pandemic?
Sure, and I think Mara hit a lot of the highlights, truthfully, but just echoing some of them and some points to consider. I think issues like step therapy, those that impact a lot of different disease states, as Mara mentioned, provide an opportunity to get a large group of advocates and patient volunteers together. And with a virtual format, it's easier. I think Mara and yourself and the chairman had mentioned that those with mobility issues in particular, it does make it easier, health issues, makes it easier to participate. So getting a large group like that together to emphasize again that an issue like step therapy does impact a very large population across different therapeutic areas is a powerful message and an important way to make a point that this legislation is urgent and necessary. So that is absolutely a best advocacy practice, in my opinion. I think other opportunities to get groups together, because I mentioned the legislative schedule, the typical schedule for a legislator hasn't gotten any shorter. I think caucuses and other opportunities to present to a group of legislators interested in the same issue is an excellent opportunity, and outreach is important. So I think that ever more so in a virtual format, being proactive about asking to present, participating in informational briefing, I mentioned they're more common now, are great ways. And I've seen organizations in other states have a lot of success with that. In particular, the caucuses, I think that is a great opportunity. And, I've certainly been on my fair of Zoom meetings of those, and I think that they've been effective. I think Mara hit a lot of, I think, the best recommendations from a patient advocacy standpoint. Videos in particular, short videos, I want to emphasize that, and petitions are still very much important and effective. At the Arthritis Foundation, we used to always say that the patients you're the expert on your own story, and that is something only you can tell. And that is very true still, obviously, in a virtual format. So any way that you can get that across in a clear, concise, effective way, like a short video testimonial or a personalized letter, Mara mentioned that too, absolutely a best advocacy practice. And the very last thing I'll say is just, I think, we spend a lot of time discussing ways to address the COVID pandemic and issues like step therapy and others, and taking advantage of some of the conversations that the chairman mentioned too, and incorporating some of your messaging in that is also an effective advocacy tool. So for instance, step therapy, ultimately the issue comes down to a timely access to care, right? And what are the consequences of an unnecessary and burdensome step therapy protocol? What happens to a patient if it is used inappropriately, and what are the consequences, whether it's physical or mental or emotional or otherwise. And COVID-19 certainly has exacerbated timing and access issues. I think anyone can tell you that. And so incorporating some of that messaging into the time is a great way, I think, to attract attention to the issue, but also ensure that these conversations going on up during the emergency period in many states, that this topic gets included.
And if I could add something on that, your next question. As we transition through this crisis, and we will get there and return to a near normal, driven in large part, I'll just say a little commercial, people get vaccinated and we can, sort of as, step in the neck of this virus if it has one. We have to crush it one way or another, and a vaccination program and thoroughgoing participation in that program is going to be key to being able to do that. But as we return to normal, and we will probably by the fall, if everything goes well, how will we deal with the question of access, virtual access, when we are able to gather in a room safely, and in terms of keeping up the participation from people who are either distant from the Capitol, or who have very busy schedules but can spend time by using their phone or their office computer to jump into and add a testimony to a particular issue. We should, I think very carefully how we integrate the face-to-face contact that we're certainly used to, and this technology that has allowed a lot more interaction from a great distance as we engage in deliberations into the fall and beyond. I did notice on the question about the Rare Disease Advisory Council, my staff is on, and just take a note, Mitch, to follow up with me on that, and I imagine others on this call may do that as well. So we'll try to run down the question on the Advisory Council.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was going to flag that for you. That's obviously a bill that we've been involved in, many of our patient advocates as well. And, really just to sort of shine a light on rare diseases in New Jersey, how we can improve treatment and access and everything else for rare diseases. And so it's Assemblyman Benson, Assemblyman Dancer, I think Assemblyman Borelli is on the bill as well. So yeah, thank you very much for commenting on that. Mara, back to you. So many groups are engaged in virtual advocacy. I guess a couple questions. How can you sort of ensure that the messages that groups are delivering are really standing out? And then Mr. Chairman, Chairman Conaway referred to when we do get back to sort of more in person, and specific to step therapy, what have you seen in other states that have generally worked, and then more specific to this particular issue, what's been sort of a really effective in terms of getting that message to stand out and get noticed?
Yeah, I think one of the most important ways, and this is going to echo a lot of what Ben has said, is really to share those important patient stories. So whether that's you sharing a patient story, you retelling it, you as an organization, or having your patients share them themselves, especially right now at this time of year. When I think about step therapy, I keep thinking about how we are in the middle of an unprecedented public health crisis with concerns about the healthcare system being overburdened and healthcare providers burning out. Yet we all here know that many people with chronic illnesses are still being required to jump through hoops to access their life-changing medication. And without this medication, they're risking relapse or worsening disease or disability, including hospitalization on what is likely going to be an overburdened system. But not only that, physicians' offices are still burdened with all the paperwork and the appeals. So when a time more than ever, they should be focused on patient care, they're spending countless hours filling out paperwork and doing these peer-to-peer reviews just to get their patients the medication that they originally prescribed. And we're going into a, unfortunately, really dark time in this pandemic, but we're also going into the start of new plan years with new formularies and new utilization management requirements. And a lot of our patients are going to have to start these step therapies, these steps again. So I think now is a really important time to make sure you're sharing those stories. I also suggest having a lot of action in a short period of time, like a targeted day or a targeted week. Here at the MS Society, we have been having virtual state action days across the country, including a successful day here in New Jersey in September, and we were focused on the issue of step therapy. We did it all: social media, virtual meetings, phone calls, and emails. And on that day, our MS activists made almost 200 connections with legislative offices just here in New Jersey. So I'd really hope that we were noticed that day, and we did get some great feedback. But there's also free resources that you and your organization should consider utilizing, like the media. You have a patient write an op-ed, do a letter to the editor campaign. If you're part of a coalition, consider a virtual press conference. We did that in Pennsylvania around the issue of step therapy, and we got some great press from it. So there's lots of different ways you can continue to engage virtually, but standing out a little bit more than just some form emails.
And Mara, I know you mentioned earlier in your comments a specific platform that you had worked with, and you're maybe talk a little bit about your experience with that, and then maybe how you arrived at that platform. Sort of anything that might, for those that are interested in sort of pursuing some of these resources, if there's anything, any advice on specific to that front, that you would offer.
So we at the MS Society use the platform Phone to Action. Our contract actually started March 1st, so it was good timing on our behalf, not planned that way. I'm not sure of all the details of how we chose that platform. We are a national organization, so those did happen a little bit above me, but it's a great user-friendly platform. We have our activist email list, and we can send state or federal. We can even do specific legislative districts, and there's different ways you can ask. Say they'll get an email and email your legislators on this issue, but they can also call their legislators on certain issues, and it will direct them there with a script. So it has definitely had its benefits, especially as we switch to this virtual world.
Thank you. And Chairman Conaway, to go back to something you mentioned, and I've seen a few comments, and I'm sure you have here in the chat box, in terms of making sure that as we move forward, we're able to, as much as possible, include some folks that might not necessarily be able to get to Trenton, or if they are, I know we had last year as an example, we learned that you can't get someone in a wheelchair, for instance, into the gallery of the General Assembly, which is a real challenge in terms of accessibility if someone would like to watch the proceedings or a voting session or whatever. So just appreciate your work there, and just want to reemphasize it's certainly a huge issue for as much as we can with folks that as broaden as much as we can their ability to see the proceedings both in person and online.
Well, you raised a good issue. There are, and while it's there are limitations of space. But with enough advance notice, arrangements can be made for one or two persons who are wheelchair bound to be able to get on the floor. I'm sure that can be arranged. It will need some advanced planning to make sure that we've got space issues. That floor can get pretty crowded, but I think that can be arranged. So just keep that in mind. If someone is on a day when we are in session and someone would like to come down, just let me know, and we'll try to get that taken care of. I must say I do have to run. If there's any one last burning thing you need to let me know or ask me, this is the time, because I do have to get on to other pressing matters today. So
no, we appreciate it. We only have a few minutes left here as it is. So I guess, Mr. Chairman, before I get to Ben and Mara to ask for their last thoughts, I guess and again, anybody who has any chat questions, please feel free in these last few minutes here to pop them in the chat there. But I guess any for our patient advocates that are listening today, and there are many of them, any sort of final thoughts or tips or things that you would impart on them for those who are listening today as they're looking to make their case in Trenton and Washington, or wherever their state capital might be.
Well, the one thing, and the first thing I would say is be and remain a brave heart, and persistence and fortitude in the work that you do. It's absolutely critical if we're to make improvements across the landscape in our state. The job is, as I see it, as an individual legislator, is to try to do the most good for the most people. But that I need help in that. I need information to make hopefully the best decisions with the information that's presented to me. And advocates are such an important part of that process of gathering information, understanding what's going on in the breasts of our citizens right across the state. And so if you flag a bit, or if you get discouraged on day one, just know that at least from my point of view, and I think from my colleagues generally, that you're steady persistence, your getting up the next day and taking that next step and moving forward will have an impact. And I just want to thank all of you for the great work you do, offering help and assistance to those who need it. That's part of just such an important job when it comes to looking after our human family and our family here in New Jersey in particular. So thank you for that. And when called, I'll try to be there. And so stay well and stay safe, and I will see you down the road.
Thank you so much, Chairman Conaway. We really appreciate you being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully. So thank you again.
Very good. Glad to spend time.
So thank you very much. So same question. I know we just have a few minutes left here before we move on to our next panel, and we appreciate the terrific questions we've gotten in the chat, and appreciate Chairman Conaway for joining us, as well as Mara and Ben. Ben, why don't we start with you? And same question, any tips that you would offer are, any couple final remarks that you'd offer our advocates on the Zoom today on, how to get their message across, and really, how to move their critical mission, whether it's step therapy, or we talked about the Rare Disease Advisory Council, whatever it is that their mission is right now. Any thoughts on a couple tips on how they can best get those messages across?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's an extraordinary time, and so I just want to recognize all the extraordinary work that many patient advocacy organizations are doing. It's a hard time to do advocacy, but patient engagement in general, because of the challenging environment, the health, the emotional stress, and everything that's going on. But to that end, I used to tell my team at the Arthritis Foundation that what we're doing is we're building a capacity for change. And so to do that in a virtual environment, I think there's a mix of activities, both fun and advocacy related, that you can help do that to build a community. And I've noticed a lot of patient advocacy organizations mixing in virtual exercise regimens. I've seen, like there was a Netflix one that I saw, an Invite Go Out. This mix of fun, but also relevant to the issues that are important to the patient advocacy organization to help build that community. Keep doing that. I think that is a wonderful, creative strategy to help build a stronger patient community in a virtual environment. And the last one I'll say is just, again, take advantage of digital advocacy. I mean, Mara just ran off a lot of the amazing work that MS Society and others are doing, but put more on social media, put more video testimonials together, whether you're using Phone to Action or another platform. There are a lot of ways, technical and otherwise, to advocate and make the most use of this, because even after this pandemic ends, and hopefully it does end soon, as the chairman said, those are still going to be relevant, and those are going to be important skills for those volunteers to have.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate your participation, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you again sometime soon. Mara, we got 2 minutes left, and in those last 2 minutes, same question to you. What's on your mind? What are a couple of last parting thoughts that we can give our advocates on the Zoom today on how they can best deliver that message?
I think just remember that advocacy is a marathon. It is not a sprint. New Jersey has 2-year-long legislative sessions, and sometimes it can be tough to work on something for 2 years and it doesn't advance, but that doesn't mean you lost. It just means you got to start again the next session. And the work we're doing is really important, and we're sharing important patient stories, and there are solutions out there to many of the issues our patients are facing. And I know it's been really hard few years really to be a patient advocate, but I think that we're moving forward, and hopefully we'll have some solutions in the near future.
Thank you so much, Mara, and thank you again, Ben, and thank you again to Chairman Conaway for joining us today. And thank you for all of you for listening and really, putting some terrific questions in the chat. So we really appreciate all of your participation today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Randy Bromberg. I've worked with her for years now. You think I'd be able to say her name correctly. I'm going to turn it over to our friend and colleague, Randy Bromberg, to bring us to the next panel. Here you go. Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, John, and thank you, everyone. This was a great panel. Really a lot of great best practices and suggestions during this difficult time. So far, I have been thrilled with the engagement from all of those in the audience, and we hope that you will continue to do so. We are going to take a 5-minute break, and that is break, meaning please don't go far, but we want to give you time to go grab a cup of coffee and come on back. We will be starting at 11 o'clock sharp. So do not get on a call. We don't want to lose you. Come on back. We have a very, very exciting last session on Empower, and the advocates, caregivers, patients, and industry folks that we have participating will really leave us on a really important note. So go get yourself a cup of coffee, and we will be back at 11 sharp. Thank you all for being with us this morning.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. And I'd like to thank our first two panels. I thought they did a terrific job. Thank you to my two colleagues, Randy and John, for their partnership. Certainly a special thank you to Chairman Conway, a true champion for patients, for taking the time and for his ongoing work for patients. And again, to everyone who's contributed to this day, including our generous sponsors. We couldn't do it without them. Also, apologies. There we go. Although this is our last session, we hope that you will meet us afterwards for a networking meetup where we'll continue today's conversation. Now, as we know, sadly, there are still many disease areas where therapies, treatments, and cures have not yet been discovered, leaving patients and caregivers looking for hope. During this next session, we're going to hear from patients, caregivers, and advocates who have each made remarkable strides in their respective journeys for the discovery of a cure. They're going to share their real life stories for us to learn from and be empowered by. And to lead the discussion, I'm thrilled to welcome my good friend, and I say it every time I introduce her, but it's the best way to describe her, the patient advocate's patient advocate, who's been such a driving force behind BioNJ's Patient Advocacy Summit since the beginning. She is now a BioNJ board member and chief patient advocate for Amicus Therapeutics, and again, a good friend to BioNJ and to me, Jane Gershkowitz. Jane, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Debbie. I really appreciate that introduction, and it's great to be with all of you today. Thank you for pulling together just another wonderful program. I think everybody who is part of the planning process was just so committed to having this, just like every other summit before this, to be really helpful, insightful, and inspirational content. And I think that we're there. And with this last session on Empower, I hope that we take it home. So thank you all for that. And I thank you to our panelists, who I will briefly introduce, but I think I was just listening to Debbie and looking at my notes in front of me, which is a great thing when it's virtual, because you can just put all your notes in front of you and nobody can see when you're looking at them and when you're reading your notes. It's great. But one of the things that just really came to me about our field of patient advocacy, whether we come at it from a disease community and a nonprofit organization, or from industry, or an industry or umbrella association, is that we have people who we've known forever, since we've been in this space. And that's where I put my friend Ron Bartek. Ron and I go way back in the rare disease community. We have been on boards together. Paula, who I will also introduce, we're just sort of starting to get to know each other because of her disease area and some common interests that we have. And then Jill, I didn't know until we started to plan this particular panel. And the beauty of it, I think, is that it really represents what we're going to talk about today. And that's that bench to bedside. Everybody's at a different place. Everybody's at a different time. With hope, you go from one and you go consistently toward the other, but there's some, there are definitely some speed humps along the way. And I also think that we have a wonderful community of advocates and how we learn from each other, we share with each other, regardless of, again, the perspective that we come from. And I do hope that today we'll be able to do that for all of you. As Debbie said, that there are so many disease areas, be they common disorders, but in particular rare disorders that just don't have treatments yet. And while the word cure was mentioned, we'll all go for treatments first. Let's get to the treatments and continue to aim for the cures. And one of our colleagues really brought this idea to the forefront, and that's our committee co-member, I should say, of our committee, Debbie Yobbs. And Debbie's the president and the executive director of the Creutzfeldt-Jakob Disease Foundation, CJD. And I've known about that disease for many, many years. And 2 years ago, lost my neighbor very quickly to CJD. And I think what's important is that we keep in mind that no matter the advancements that we make, that we have many more to go. And as we lead organizations in particular disease areas, we want people to have the tools that they need to get to where they want to be. We want for people who are sort of further along on their journey, maybe their organization, maybe their advocacy work is more sophisticated. We want them to always come back to where they were so they can share those best practices. And thinking about, again, bench to bedside, when you think about the role of patients, whether it's an individual who's living with a disease, their family, their organization, their disease community, it's bench to bedside, but it really starts at the bedside when it's a patient or a caregiver. You're caring for someone, you're living with a disease, and that's the bedside. And you have to implore upon people the importance of getting from the bedside to the bench so you can come back to the bedside and really make a difference in people's lives. And I'm thrilled to have with us today 3 people who are going to help us think about that. Ron Bartek, who's the co-founder and president of the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, FARA. Paula Evans, who's the founder and chairperson of the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics, or FAST. So we have FARA, we have FAST, and then we have Jill Feldman. Jill is the founder of the EGFR Resistors Group, and she's going to tell us more about that. So we've got a lot of acronyms, but I think what's most important, like with anything, is the people behind the acronyms, the Rons, the Paulas, and the Jills. So with that, I am going to ask each of our panelists to just give a couple of minutes of an introduction to themselves and their work. And then we'll get into some questions that we've prepared, and we hope that you will use the chat feature to put your own questions in for our guests. So I'm going to ask Jill if she would introduce herself, and then Ron, and then Paula. Jill?
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for the opportunity to join today's discussion. The EGFR resistors is the acronym stands for a type of lung cancer. And I am a lung cancer patient and I'm an advocate, but my story actually started long before I became a patient. And when I was 13, I lost 2 grandparents and my dad to lung cancer. And then in my 20s, both my mom and my aunt died of lung cancer. And, you sit there and you think, wow, lung cancer, it is, it's the #1 cancer killer in the country. But a lot of people don't realize it has always been the least funded of all the major cancers. And stigma was a huge barrier, but also people didn't live long enough to become advocates. And so I got involved actually in lung cancer advocacy back in 2001 after all of the losses. The Longevity Foundation was the first organization in the country dedicated exclusively to lung cancer, and I got involved. And when it was right off the ground, and I did what I could to get educated and be an advocate. And while doing so in 2009 is when I was diagnosed with lung cancer. I was 39 years old. My kids were 6, 8, 10, and 12 at the time. And their only association with the disease was death. But I was following in my family's footsteps, and there still wasn't any promising research that convinced me that the path would change. And at the time, they had just started discovering different alterations in lung cancer. And although, the research was still moving slowly, it was in the right direction. And it was becoming very clear that lung cancer was not one disease. The mutations or the oncogenes that were found to be driving these cancers were being discovered. And so were a few of the first targeted therapies in lung cancer. Prior to that, you had 3 options. It was chemo, radiation, or surgery. for everybody. But with these discoveries, lung cancer became more complex and complicated. And again, while 250,000 people are diagnosed with lung cancer each year, these oncogene-driven cancers like EGFR, or you may have heard of ALK or ROS1, they're actually rare. In fact, in the non-academic or research setting, oftentimes doctors, oncologists don't know about them, so they don't know to test for them. Or in some situations, they may see one patient a year. So the targeted therapies that have been developed have proven superior to traditional chemotherapy for these onco-driven cancers, but they're not a cure, and inevitably the cancer develops resistance. And for the EGFR community, there isn't a next option. And there's not a next option because the mechanisms that cause these resistance vary greatly person to person, and there's no way to predict what that resistance mechanism would be. So in mid 2017, like many other diseases, you know, social media is booming and patients and caregivers are finding each other on these platforms. And in mid 2017, I, along with 5 other patients with EGFR positive lung cancer, one caregiver, we founded the EGFR Resistors. And our first step was to create this closed Facebook group where we could provide information and support. And we also created a website where we could communicate with the broader EGFR community, and a Twitter handle. We now have a monthly newsletter. But it was to, you know, a greatly unneeded niche to fill, or needed niche to fill, because in just a little over 3 years, we have over 2,000 members from 70 countries. But, you know, we're not a 501c3. We are a patient group. And a lot of people ask, why aren't you a 501c3 if you are trying to get funding for research? Well, because of the nature of the disease, which includes low survival rates, I am one of not many that has beaten the odds of living more than 5 years. But because of that, because of lack of effective treatments, and how sick people are when they progress, we've had limited resources, and it has been difficult. But what we've tried to do is really strategically spend our collective time and efforts on projects that would have direct impact. And it still isn't easy to have that great influence when there's only a few people doing the work. But so one of the things, I guess I'll mention one thing that we have done that has had impact, and as patients, right? So we know what we need, and we knew we could use the strength of our membership to understand and address like the critical gaps in practice and in research in our community. So we actually approached Longevity Foundation, a nonprofit, and asked to collaborate with them and use their fundraising platform to fund an IRB approved longitudinal survey, because we wanted to really understand the lived experience of people with EGFR lung cancer, and to understand treatment sequences so that we could help researchers find those important research questions that were important and meaningful to us, not to what they thought was important and meaningful. And so I'm happy to share at any time anything about what we did. But I think the most important part of that was, where we would begin. Again, building that community was huge, because this data would not exist without our motivated and powerful community. And what was so empowering to us was we realized we are able to drive research, involve patients, and gather data that no one scientist, physician, or institution ever could. And that data, if used correctly, could provide critical insights that would lead to better care. And so we are trying to continue to move forward with using some of those strengths.
That's great, Jill. Thank you so much. It's interesting in hearing you talk about the critical role of social media in finding and building your community. I'm going to turn to Ron and have him give an introduction to himself and the work of his organization. And as my experience from when I ran a large national patient organization, we didn't have social media to start. So, but Ron has built quite an amazing organization to also get from bedside to bench and back to the bedside. So Ron, please.
Thank you very much, Jane, for your very kind introduction and your friendship over the many years that you referred to. I want to also thank BioNJ and BMS and others for including us patient advocates in this important meeting. So as Jane mentioned, I'm the co-founder and president of the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, henceforth FARA. My wife Rachel and I founded that organization, hard to believe, but 22 years ago. And our story has much in common with the one you've just heard from Jill and other panelists that you will hear from. And I'm sure it has much in common with many of you. In 1997, we had 3 little boys who were 9, 11, and 13 when that middle son, Keith, was first diagnosed with a disorder we'd never heard of, namely Friedreich's ataxia. The challenges we faced then and continue to face will sound familiar to many of you. First, we learned Keith would get very sick very fast. We also learned that FA was rare, about 5,000 American patients, maybe 15 to 20,000 worldwide, who, like Keith, were diagnosed young and were expected to live only into early adulthood at most. We saw too that there was very little research underway, no clinical trials ongoing at the time, no pharmaceutical companies involved, very little awareness of the disease. No one had ever heard of Friedreich's ataxia as far as we could tell. And we also saw that the patient families were isolated without much reason for hope. There was no organization devoted solely to our disease and supporting its research. But the only good news we saw was that we'd also learned that the FA gene had been identified almost a year to the day earlier. And we decided at that point that if we were able to assemble a good organization and along with some resources, we might be able to make a significant difference in this community. So we founded FARA in 1998 with a board consisting of 7 FA parents like ourselves, 1 young adult patient, and 3 leading FA scientists. We began by assembling the field. We got the scientists together for the first time using an NIH workshop grant. We organized and conducted the world's, therefore, first international scientific conference on our disease. In that conference, we assembled 80 scientists from around the world, that had some interest in, had some concern about FA. We invited a good number of pharma partners or prospective pharma partners, but they all declined, saying, "You're too rare, you're on your own." I bet you that's something people in this meeting have heard before. Only 1 other advocacy organization participated, and there were no clinical trials at all in our disease underway at the time. But building on the lessons learned and collaboration spawned at that first conference, we set about building what we considered the field of dreams, borrowed from the movie that many of you have seen, in which Kevin Costner concludes that if you build it, they will come. Our field of dreams, we thought, would involve developing the assets prospective pharma partners in the industry would need to succeed in FA. So We knew we would need to bring the patient community together, bring the scientific community together, support the basic science that would lead to understanding and characterizing our disease, support the translational science involving the assays, cell and animal models, biorepositories, and so forth, needed for translational investigations. We needed to build a natural history database or / patient registry, if you will, and use that registry or build a separate demographic registry for recruiting patients in the clinical trials that we hope to be able to initiate. We also knew we wanted to build and nurture good relationships with all the stakeholders, patients, academic investigators, other advocacy organizations, and government partners like the NIH, the FDA, and Congress. Our key word was always collaborate. We wanted to collaborate with all those stakeholders rather than compete with them or confront them. The net result has been that a year ago, we organized and conducted our 7th International Scientific Conference on our disease, and its active participants numbered about 450, as opposed to those 80 that joined us in 1999. And those participants included more than 36 pharma partners, not 0, and keynote speakers from the NIH and FDA leadership, academic investigators from around the world, and 16 other advocacy organization partners. At that time, we had 9 FA clinical trials underway and a number of others in late planning stages, including very promising approaches to address the underlying cause of our disease for the first time, such as protein replacement and gene therapy, for which we now have 7 companies and 3 major universities aggressively advancing programs. So we've continued to build our field of dreams. They have continued to come, if you will, and have given us reason to believe that our dreams will come true. So I'll stop there now and thank you again, Jane.
Thank you, Ron. So it's my pleasure now to turn to Paula Evans and have Paula tell you a little bit about herself and her work with the Angelman community.
Thank you, Jane. And thank you, Randy and Jane, both of you, for inviting me to participate in today's event. I think it's very important. As the introduction stated, there's still so many rare diseases where there are no treatments. And I think this is just a really very hopeful time to develop treatments for those rare diseases. Being able to share resources and experiences and information from one rare disease group to another is so critical in advancing all of the disease areas. So my name is Paula Evans. I am the founder and chairperson of an NPO called the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. And my story is so completely similar to Ron's that if I walked you through my whole introduction, it would just sound so redundant. So I'm very appreciative to people like Ron who have paved the path, before some of the newer foundations, because we really borrowed from your experience and expertise. But I started the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics in 2008, August 2008. I have a daughter with Angelman syndrome. At the time that I started the organization, she was 4 years old. She turned 16 this year. And to see the progress that's been made in the last dozen years has been really breathtaking. So for any rare disease patient advocacy group that's listening in today and hearing things like 12 years and 22 years that we've been in this space, please don't be discouraged by that, because the advancement of technologies that are applicable to treating many rare diseases right now, those have exploded in the last couple of years. So don't look at maybe Ron's path and my path and think like you don't have a dozen years or 22 years to get to your goal, because there's really been remarkable advances in just in the past few years. But anyway, I started the organization much for the same reasons that Ron did, to invest in translational science, to develop the tools needed to develop therapeutics for this disorder. Angelman syndrome is a rare neurogenetic disorder. It involves one gene. We have a bit higher of an incidence rate than Friedreich's ataxia. We're somewhere between 1 in 12 and 1 in 20,000 patients. So we have a fairly large patient population. Some of the additional things we did that Ron didn't mention was we reached a point in time where we knew our scientific path was solid, and we knew that some of these technologies that were getting ready for prime time would be very beneficial for us in the clinic. But we came to the realization that what we were lacking in were proper tools to assess these therapeutics once they were in the clinic. So that was another area that we decided to focus on, was the development of outcome measures and biomarkers for our specific disease population. Once we were in the clinic, did we have the right tools to assess whether a therapeutic was effective? So that's an area you may want to consider probably some years before you're ready to actually start clinical trials. But what I want to impart to this audience is that my organization funded a specific area of research that identified a potential therapeutic. And we were very much about controlling our own destiny, kind of like what Jill touched upon. And we were able to take that discovery that was made in an academic lab, and our nonprofit organization developed its own for-profit biotech company. So we were able to bring in outside investors to look specifically at that particular potential therapeutic option. And we developed that. We did the IND ourselves, and we started, this was an antisense oligonucleotide, and we brought that into the clinic this past February. So the rare disease patient advocacy field has grown so much. You really have the power to control your own destiny, in much the way that Jill mentioned and Ron mentioned, but you can even go that extra step and be drug developers for your particular disease. So the company we started is called Genetics Biotherapeutics, and we're just delighted at how that is going. We've been able to show efficacy. It's been a bit of a bumpy road because we had some toxicity issues, but overall, we were able to show the industry at large that this is a treatable disorder. So again, thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you to Randy and Jane for inviting me today.
That's great, Paula. Thank you. And I think that as you listen to Jill, to Ron, to Paula, you can see the thread, and you can see how things start and how they grow and how they continue to flourish. I will not say finish. I think we all look toward days when we won't need organizations, because diseases will have the treatments that they need and people can live healthy lives. Until then, we will all be here for each other. Paula, you mentioned something that I want to get back to, and that is industry and the work, the partnership, developing rapport with industry. And Ron, we hear all the time from newer advocates, people who are newer to the space, that they're not sure how to initiate that step. How do they try to cultivate a connection, start a conversation with industry? And industry people sometimes think of as like all of these different companies, and sometimes they think of one company. And so, with patients and caregivers involved in drug development, starting, at the earliest discovery stage, what can you share in terms of advice for cultivating that interest in industry?
Well, thank you again, Jane, for raising this very important issue. It's going to vary from whatever stage you're in or get into, but I would say from the beginning, as I mentioned before, we had no industry partners. And so we had to make those initial contacts. And we started by inviting them to our events, our scientific events. So we thought if they were to come to those, they might, hear something, see something that piqued their interest. That wasn't successful initially because we invited them to that first conference in 1999 and all of them declined. But we kept pressing that and kept inviting them to the second, third, fourth, and seventh of these international conferences. And to the second one, 6 came, to the third, a dozen came, to the fourth, they had like 25, and eventually the one last year, a year ago, there were more than 36 industry partners. So we kept going, we never gave up. In a couple of cases, we also used the matchmaker technique. You know, when we had a promising or interesting discovery by an academic investigator, we did two things. We made sure that our translational tools were made available to that academic investigator so they could start doing some of the preclinical studies to de-risk the program for prospective industry partners. And then we started going to industry partners. We thought when we looked at their portfolio, when we looked at their plans, if we saw a match between that discovery and that industry partner, we started trying to do the matchmaking with that academic investigator. We also began to suggest to our prospective industry partners grand rounds. We would visit them with a couple of patients, with our FARA leadership, with one of our lead or two of our lead clinicians, and do a grand round. And boy, did we make some tremendous headway doing that way. We also took the approach of introducing them to our patients. And there's something about a patient that steals your heart, and so all those techniques worked to the point that eventually these pharmaceutical partners started coming to us. We no longer had to go to them. They would start contacting us before they even had a target, before they had a therapeutic approach for our disease. They realized, you know, the tremendous strides we'd made and all the assets in our field of dreams, and said, we want to work with you. We like how you roll, and we see that you've got the assets we need to succeed. So all that. I finally end up by saying it's not just the industry partners you need to cultivate, but it's our government partners as well, like the NIH and the FDA. And the FDA has been so profoundly beneficial to all of us by reaching out in the form of patient engagement and patient-focused drug development. And we've made giant strides there, you know, developing the relationships that we enjoy now with the externally led patient-focused drug development meetings and so forth. So it's all about reaching out to all your stakeholders and initiating that contact, and then continuing to nurture them. So thank you.
Thank you, Ron. So I'd like Paula and Jill to maybe jump in on this. You know, Paula, your perspective is a little bit different because you've been able to go on and start your own company in industry. And so maybe you could just very briefly address why you made that decision, because we know, and there's already something in the chat from other advocate communities that are interested in doing the same thing, but are a little bit unsure about how to do that. And the other piece I think that I've heard, and this speaks to what Jill is doing with EGFR resistors, and that's collecting data, having registries, having the databases, which can be so important not only to academic researchers, but really can help to state one's case to industry of what we've got here. We've got something here and it's worthy of your attention. So maybe each of you could just jump in quickly on that, if you would.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So again, our story is so eerily similar to Ron's. It's so funny, he speaks and I'm like, gosh, that was our life. Much like Ron, when I started FAST, there was no industry interest. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And Ron, I'm sure will agree with me here. Those were early days, and the emerging technologies that we have now just weren't, you know, they weren't realistic back then. So, you know, and I just want to stress that industry is very interested in rare disease. If you could check a lot of their boxes, because there's a lot of money to be made in the development of rare therapeutics. So just keep that in mind. But yes, I agree with Ron. You want to engage with these industries. You do want to do a matchmaking process. Who has something in their pipeline where the technologies would line up with the technology you need to develop a therapeutic? Is your science sound? Do you have a clear understanding what causes your disease? Is there a clear path to addressing that cause? Do you have a well-organized community? Natural history data is very important. You want to check all those boxes. What happened with FAST, and much like Ron, we have many pharma industry partners at the Angelman table right now. We just had a conference last weekend. I believe we had over 20 pharma companies there that are all developing therapeutics for Angelman. What we did with genetics biotherapeutics was we had funded a program looking at a particular strategy, and it was to activate a normally silent gene that would potentially address the lack of protein issue in the brain of individuals with Angelman syndrome. And we had invested significantly as an NPO into that area of research. And when it became clear that we identified something very valuable, we then did some quick proof of concept work. We realized we had something very powerful, but like Ron said, industry at that point would have considered it very early in the development stage. And so we just decided to develop it ourselves. So the NPO took license to the product from the academic institution. We formed a company. We were able to bring in some investors and literally just do the additional work necessary to get it IND ready, investigational new drug, which is what you'll need to do for FDA clearance. We were able to carry out our IND enabling studies, preparing it for a phase 1/2 clinical trial. And at that time, we partnered the program with a larger pharma, Ultragenyx Pharmaceuticals, to make sure we had enough funding to get through the phase 1/2 trial. I will reiterate another thing that Ron brought up was the engagement with the FDA. We got in under the patient focus listening session, and the FDA was wonderful, because going back to the being mindful of having the proper assessment tools for once you get into the clinic, the FDA was actually very helpful there. We explained to them the challenges we had with assessing the efficacy of a therapeutic in this patient population, and they actually assisted us in creating a novel outcome measure to use in the clinic. So, we're at a point in time that everyone wants to kind of partner and help you along, and you should take advantage of that. But definitely put together especially in this age we're living in now, where everything is online, put together a presentation with the highlights of your disease area and your organization and what you bring to the table, and just keep hitting those pharma companies that are aligned or in the same area that, of a strategy that you would need to deploy to develop effective therapeutics for your condition, and try and get on their radar. And like Ron said, invite them to your scientific meetings. I would try and keep those free, and open, so that, cost them nothing to attend. Really what you want to do is get their interest.
Great. Thank you, Paula. You talked about what's meaningful, and Jill, you had mentioned that in your opening comments about what's meaningful to the individual patient and what's going to matter, and collecting data to support that. Maybe you'd like to just, piggyback onto Ron and Paula's comments, and maybe even talk about that, because you're in a slightly different stage than these other disease communities.
Yes, yeah, years behind, and what both Paul and Ron have done is amazing, and it definitely gives me hope as we slowly move forward. In our first step too, in trying to figure out, so we did that IRB approved survey because, and we decided that data was going to be open source, because we wanted it to be used. We wanted to be used. We wanted industry to be interested in it. We wanted scientists, researchers to be interested in it. One of the things when we first got started, we actually, coincidence or fate, kind of connected with a continuing medical education company who secured funding, helped us secure funding from industry to put together a think tank, because it's so overwhelming in the beginning. It's like, okay, there's all these unmet urgent needs. Where do we begin? And so with industry, we had started this survey. And so we put together this think tank, and we brought together top thought leaders in EGFR lung cancer, multidisciplinary. And we kind of talked about the unmet needs clinically, but in research, and where do we begin, especially because there's no one patient that's the same, especially when they have progression. And one of the ideas someone came up with was to do a research summit for young investigators. And we thought that was a fantastic idea, because we could hopefully gain interest in the EGFR lung cancer space. We could also kind of gauge what's going on out there. And again, the CME company that has been wonderful to us has helped us secure that funding, because not being a 501c3, it's hard, number one. And number two, you know, I'm sure anyone out there who's heard anything about lung cancer, everything is about immunotherapy right now. And that doesn't work for us at all. In fact, after being on targeted therapy, it is extremely dangerous at times. So we just finished our second annual EGFR Research Summit, where 21 young investigators, it was virtual this year, they submit their abstracts. It's unpublished work. And we have thought leaders as judges and mentors. And we are trying to be creative in using this platform. And we also provided like training and presentation, grant writing training, and mentoring from some of the more experienced physicians and scientists. And so we've really, the way we've worked our way into partnering with industry is very different. And but it's been really successful. And with the IRB approved survey that we did, we have presented some of that data, and where I have a mini oral next month at World Conference on Lung Cancer with some more of the data. And so getting our way into those conferences as well, and writing those abstracts, which people are more than willing to help anybody with them. Getting a mini oral was huge. A poster is big. And reaching out to industry and letting them know, hey, we're presenting this data. And so I feel like almost like we haven't figured out exactly the best way yet, but we're trying to be creative in our approach to get the attention that we want to get to ultimately drive those questions and fund that research.
That's phenomenal. You know, you mentioned a few words that I think are important to sort of highlight. When talking about Paula and Ron, who've been at this a little bit longer than you, Jill, you said that they give you hope. And that's what we really want this conversation to do, because it can feel very overwhelming and daunting when you hear that for some disease communities, it's been 8 years, it's been 15 years, it's been 20 plus years, and maybe they're not there yet. So that in itself, somebody could just say, oh my gosh, this is a non-starter. Somebody else might be thinking, okay, it's not about the time, but it's about all of those things you have to do. And it sounds overwhelming. And so we would say, focus on, have a plan and focus on those things that are most immediate. But the other word that you used is value. And I think that, and Ron talked about the importance of hearing a patient's story. And we all know that, okay? And the industry in general, and I would say more so big pharma, in the last 8 years or so has finally discovered that they're in business because of patients. And so to be patient focused and all of that should be no surprise. It should always have been, number one. And now that it's completely understood as the role of the patient and the caregiver, as Ron mentioned, patient-focused drug development, it's legislated into 21st Century Cures Act from December 2016. Everything is now there. We also have to think about compliance. Industry has its compliance guidances that it must adhere to. And Jill, what you outlined with this CME program, where you worked with a CME firm that was able to raise money appropriately because industry needs that third party, that independent, that that non-conflicted entity to develop a lot of these forums for physician and researcher education. And the value that a patient organization can bring, either in partnership with the CME firm, as you've described, or on its own with the work that it's done and the scientific workshops that it convenes, as Ron and both Paula have talked about, that helps industry and that brings a value, and it enables them to start to explore things very compliantly. And that's another layer of complexity, the whole compliance issue that 20 plus years ago was very different than it is today. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think that we've talked about taking things sort of from the academic lab into industry. And we talked about some of those things, the data, the things that show what's meaningful for the patients. Can we just talk a minute about registries? Because registries, we've hinted at it, but we're learning that registries are more and more important because they are not just where data is housed, but they help determine what's the most important data to get. We all know, the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. So you have basically one opportunity to get quality in, to give quality out. And we're also seeing a very strong trend in the last decade of patient organizations, patient communities, developing those registries and owning and operating them, which is different than a product registry that is owned by industry and tends to be proprietary. So maybe, Ron, you could just quickly talk about the registry that you've been able to develop globally for Friedreich's ataxia, and then I'd like to open it up to questions. And we've been granted an extra 5 minutes, so if we can do this in 1 minute or so, and then we'll get to a couple questions from.
Okay, I'll try to be brief because you've touched upon if there's a single thing we've done that I would consider the most important, it would be our patient registry. And I would say it different. It's our natural history database, and because there's so much confusion about the difference between a natural history database and a patient registry. But we've got two things that are called patient registries. One is largely demographic that we use for recruiting, identifying our patients and recruiting for clinical research. The other is our natural history database. And there's nothing more important that we've done than develop a robust natural history database. It's got about 1,600 of our patients in it over about 16 years of their natural history development. And because it's the basis for so many other things, like selection of patient population for a clinical trial. Which patients in which period of progression are best suited to this therapeutic, therefore should be recruited to this clinical trial. Which outcome measures was mentioned earlier that should be used to in this particular clinical trial for this particular therapeutic. So the whole clinical trial protocol design is based on your natural history study. So I will stop there and say that Those two things are two of the three corners of our stool, three legs of our stool. And that patient registry for recruitment and the natural history database, the third being the clinical network that we've built up over time.
That's great, Ron. Thank you. I'm just looking at some of the chat comments and questions, and one is about, and we talked about this a little bit before, which was how do you put your story together? And in the previous panel, they talked about that as well. So I think that that's something very important. And there are a lot of resources out there for folks who might be familiar with Global Genes. Global Genes has numerous toolkits that they put together over the years that help almost step by step tell you how to tell your story, how to share your story. We have a great organization, or a great firm based here in New Jersey, Smith Solve, and they've really done an incredible job of helping people share their story. How do you do it? How do you do it effectively? So there are many different tools out there. I don't know if Paula or Ron, any of you want to jump on that question about maybe what's sort of the best or the most effective way to tell your story.
I'm just going to jump in and say, I don't think there's a best way to tell your story. You're going to know what the best way is to tell your particular story. Always putting a face to the name of the disorder is critical. You want those that are going to be interested in developing therapeutics to be intimately familiar with the patient. Obviously, if you have a disease area that is pediatric, getting little kids in front of anybody is going to, be a heart stealer. Honestly, in my opinion, what's worked for my disease area was, if you're looking at the introductory part of the journey, you want to be very concise. These people are very busy. So what are you going to put in front of them that's going to capture their attention? And really having a clearly defined understanding of the disease, having a clearly defined understanding of a pathway to treating it, having a well-organized community, and whether that's having natural history data or knowing where your patients are, or your patients being educated enough that they're ready, willing, and able to participate in studies. These are all important in the rare disease space. And you really just want to get in there really quickly, let them know that you're checking their boxes so that you pique their interest, and then invite them into bigger, lengthier discussions, and whether that's at a scientific meeting. I agree with Jill completely. When you're developing tools, and whether that be animal models or outcome measures or questionnaires, or whatever it is that you're developing to assist in the creation of therapeutics, you want to make that open access as much as you can. Having pre-competitive tools that everyone can use and benefit from and build therapeutics upon is critical. So you know how to tell your story best. No one's going to tell you what the best approach is. It's really going to depend on who you are, what you are, and what you're trying to tell. But I would, at a first step, try and keep it concise. Get in, get their attention, and then you're just going to bring them in with more and more information and data, and keep them involved in the space and give them a reason to invest.
So we've got like 1 minute left. So I'm going to ask Jill, because the last question we had when we prepared was basically, what are your must-dos? Ron's already said a must-do, if there's one thing. He's talked about registries, right? And Paula, you talked about, getting that story and understanding how to tell that story in a way that's concise, that's compelling, and that will want them to continue the conversation and be able to move your purpose forward. So Jill, what would you say is a must-do from your perspective with EGFR resistors and what you've learned so far?
Well, I would say complementary to both what Paul and Ron said and a must do. I think, having that, again, that community, whether it's one other person you're working with to help you build that community. But I think having that opportunity to be able to feed off of somebody, because again, with the theme of hope, it's really, really hard to do this alone. And you have to, I always tell myself that I don't have to cure the disease to make a difference. I just, helping one person makes a difference, but you cannot do it alone. So I think that is a must to at least have some people there helping you build it and motivating each other to do so.
I think, Jill, that's just an awesome point for us to go out on, is that none of us are in this alone. No matter how challenging things can be when we're in the situations we are. We have some of you'll see in the chat, some of those resources I mentioned from Global Genes, which are free, very important. But I think some of the highlights are hope, value, partners. It's clearly community. And I think that's what patient advocacy brings to disease. It doesn't just bring a face to industry. It actually brings a community, and it brings others who didn't realize they could be part of the community, like industry, into it. And I think that's also what BioNJ has done from the very beginning with this summit. It's created a community for all of us in patient advocacy. And when it comes to disease, people say, well, this is a community or a club that I don't want to be a member of. I wouldn't have signed up for, but I'm glad it's here. What we're fortunate to have with BioNJ is it's a community that we do want to be the members of. So with
And
that,
Jane, could I just reinforce one of your must-dos earlier, and that was you see all this that we've all done, and don't get intimidated, get started, and so, and when you do that, get started, and don't try to, as Jill just emphasized, don't try to do it alone. There are plenty of people out there that are going to help. So I would
absolutely agree. And all those people are on this call. So,
yeah.
So with that, I'm going to thank you all again. I wish you all good health and stay safe and happy holidays. Thank you for doing this, and turn it back to my friend Debbie.
So much, Jane, and well said, Ron, and to all of you, very well said. Jane, Ron, Jill, Paula, we really appreciate your time. I'd like to thank you all again, and to all of today's panelists, and Adam Lenkowski and BMS, and all of our generous sponsors, and of course our committee and our awesome BioNJ team. You got to meet a couple of folks. Hopefully by this time you know all of our team, but I hope you all found today's discussion to be valuable. A quick reminder that we will be posting a number of resources provided by today's presenters and our committee on BioNJ's website at bionj.org. Also, BioNJ membership, as I mentioned earlier, is complimentary to all patient advocacy organizations. Kim Minton is more than happy to assist you. So I'd like to invite you all to, once we end this meeting, we are going to have our networking meetup, and that will take place in another Zoom room. You should have the link to that. Meanwhile, for the next 15-ish minutes or so, please, grab your lunch, meet us at the URL on the screen starting at 12:15. We've also emailed you the link again. You should have it. So I look forward to seeing you in a few minutes. For those who are unable to join us, thank you for all that you do each and every day on behalf of patients, and please stay safe, stay well. And as now I like to say, please stay home, and we'll see you happy and healthy in person at the soonest possible moment. Thanks, everyone.